Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've never shared this experience with anyone outside my immediate family, but after lurking on this forum for months, reading similar accounts, I think I'm finally ready to talk about what happened to me 3 years ago. I'm not some superstitious person who jumps at shadows. I've been camping and hiking since I was a kid, and I've spent countless nights alone in the wilderness without incident. What happened that night in Olympic National Forest completely changed my perspective on what might be out there in the woods. It was mid-October, during that perfect window when the summer crowds have disappeared but before the serious cold sets in. I had a rare 4-day weekend and decided to head out to a remote section in the northern part of the forest that I'd been wanting to explore. I'd been under a lot of stress at work, 60-hour weeks for almost 2 months straight, and I desperately needed some solitude. I arrived at the trailhead around 2 in the afternoon. The parking area was completely empty, which didn't surprise me given it was a Thursday, and this wasn't exactly one of the popular spots. I shouldered my pack and set off down the trail, planning to hike about 5 miles in before setting up camp. The trail followed an old logging road for the first couple miles before narrowing into a proper footpath that wound through towering Douglas firs and western hemlocks. The forest floor was carpeted with thick moss, and everything had that deep, vibrant green that's unique to the Pacific Northwest. The air felt clean in my lungs, and I could feel the tension draining from my body with each step. Around 4:30, I came across a small tributary that fed into one of the larger creeks in the area. It was the perfect spot, a small clearing near the water with enough flat ground for my tent, but still sheltered by the trees. I could hear the gentle burbling of the water, and sunlight filtered through the canopy in a way that made everything look almost magical. I remember thinking I'd hit the jackpot with this sight. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and filtered water from the creek. After cooking a simple meal of dehydrated pasta, I sat by my small fire, watching the flames and sipping whiskey from my camp mug. The forest grew quiet as darkness settled in, except for the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. By 10 o'clock, I was feeling pleasantly tired and decided to turn in. I remember checking the weather on my satellite device. Clear skies predicted for the entire weekend. Before turning it off to conserve battery, I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped up the tent, and fell asleep almost immediately. I'm not sure exactly what time it was when I first woke up, maybe around 2 in the morning. What I do know is that something had changed in the forest. The normal nighttime sounds had disappeared. No insects chirping, no distant calls of nocturnal creatures, just a heavy, oppressive silence that immediately set me on edge. I lay completely still in my sleeping bag, straining to hear anything beyond the sound of my own breathing. Then I heard it, a heavy, deliberate footfall that definitely didn't belong to a deer or even a bear. Whatever was out there was big, and it was walking on 2 legs. My first thought was that another hiker had somehow found my campsite in the darkness, but that made absolutely no sense. I was miles from the trailhead, in an unmarked spot well off the main path. Besides, the footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate. Each step was followed by the crack of twigs or the shift of forest debris in a way that suggested significant weight. The footsteps circled around the perimeter of my campsite, not approaching directly, but not moving away either. It was as if whatever was out there was assessing the situation, trying to figure out what I was. I remained frozen in my sleeping bag, barely breathing, my heart hammering so hard I was sure it must be audible outside the tent. Then, the smell hit me. I've tried explaining this smell to people, but words don't do it justice. Imagine the most putrid gym locker you've ever encountered, combined with the stench of a dog that's been swimming in a stagnant pond, topped off with something like decaying meat. It was so strong it felt almost physical, like I could taste it in the back of my throat. I had to fight the urge to gag. The footsteps stopped moving. Whatever was out there was standing still, and from the direction of the smell, it was positioned just beyond the edge of my campsite, maybe 15 feet from my tent. I remember thinking, this is it. I need to see what's out there. I had a high-powered flashlight within reach, and my hunting knife was in the side pocket of the tent. I slowly, silently reached for the flashlight, my fingers just brushing against it when I heard movement again. The footsteps were approaching my tent now, deliberate, unhurried, the stench growing stronger with each step. I abandoned any thought of grabbing the flashlight and instead curled into myself, trying to make myself as small as possible. I'm not proud of that reaction, but primal fear had taken over. When the footsteps stopped right outside my tent, I could hear breathing. Deep, rhythmic breathing that sounded almost like a person's, but wrong somehow. Heavier, more resonant. I swear I could feel the air pressure change inside the tent with each exhale from the creature. What happened next is something I've replayed in my mind countless times, trying to make sense of it. There was a sound like water hitting fabric, but more forceful. It took me several seconds to realize what was happening. The creature was urinating on my tent. The stream hit the rainfly and ran down the side of the tent, some of it seeping through the junction where the rainfly met the tent body. The smell that accompanied this was even worse than before, like ammonia mixed with something deeply organic and foul. I could hear the liquid splashing onto the ground and feel the vibration through the tent floor. I was utterly humiliated and terrified at the same time. This wasn't random animal behavior. It felt deliberate, almost like a message. This is my territory. The stream seemed to go on forever, far longer than would be possible for a human or normal animal. When it finally stopped, I thought perhaps the creature would leave. It didn't. Instead, it began circling my tent again, this time much closer. I could hear its breathing and what sounded like low, almost subvocal rumbling. Not quite a growl, but something in that family of sounds. The footsteps were so close now that with each one, I could feel a slight tremor through the ground. As it circled, something brushed against the tent wall, something solid enough to push the fabric inward several inches. I bit down on my fist to keep from making any sound, tasting blood as my teeth broke the skin. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the creature stopped at what would have been the foot end of my tent. There was a moment of silence, then a sound I can only describe as a deep exhalation, almost like a sigh. Then the footsteps began to move away, back toward the forest. I lay there, completely motionless, for what must have been another hour, listening as the normal sounds of the forest gradually returned. Only when I heard the familiar chirping of insects and the distant call of an early morning bird did I dare move. Dawn was just breaking when I finally unzipped the tent enough to peer outside. The first thing I noticed was the smell, still lingering but less intense in the open air. The second thing was the state of my campsite. My carefully stacked firewood had been scattered, and my cooking gear, which I'd left on a small folding table, was strewn across the ground. I crawled out of the tent, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. That's when I saw the footprints. They were everywhere around my campsite, but particularly clear in a patch of muddy ground near the creek. I approached cautiously, still scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The prints were unmistakably foot-shaped, with 5 distinct toes, but they were enormous, easily twice the size of my own foot, and I wear a size 11. What struck me most wasn't just the size, though, but the depth of the impressions. Whatever had made these tracks was incredibly heavy, The side of my tent where the creature had marked its territory was soaked with a yellowish fluid that still reeked horribly. I gagged as I examined it, noticing that some of the fabric appeared to be slightly discolored where the liquid had made contact. I should have documented everything, taken photos of the footprints, collected samples of the fluid on my tent. That's what a rational person would have done. But in that moment, all I wanted was to get the hell out of there. I broke camp in record time, not even bothering to properly pack everything. I stuffed my tent, still wet with the creature's urine, into its compression sack and jammed it into my backpack along with the rest of my gear. I was on the trail within 20 minutes, moving as quickly as I could while still watching my surroundings. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves made me freeze in place, my heart racing. I kept thinking I caught whiffs of that distinctive odor, but it may have just been residue from my contaminated gear. The 5-mile hike back to the trailhead took me less than 2 hours. I practically ran the last mile when the parking area came into view. My car was still the only one there, and I threw my pack into the trunk without bothering to reorganize anything. I remember sitting in the driver's seat for several minutes, doors locked, just breathing and trying to process what had happened. On the drive home, I cycled through every possible explanation. A bear? No way. The footprints were clearly bipedal and nothing like bear tracks. A person playing an elaborate twisted prank. In that remote location, targeting a random camper they couldn't have known would be there. It made no sense. When I got home, the first thing I did was drag my tent into the backyard and hose it down thoroughly. Even after using heavy-duty soap, the smell lingered faintly. I ended up throwing it away and buying a new one. I couldn't bear the thought of sleeping in it again. I tried to convince myself it was just a bizarre encounter with some unknown animal, maybe a rogue bear with some kind of glandular issue that affected its scent and behavior. But deep down, I knew better. Those footprints, the deliberate nature of the encounter, the sense of intelligence behind it all. It wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. I've joked about it since then. Yeah, got my tent peed on by Bigfoot, ha, as a way to distance myself from how terrifying it actually was. But I've never gone back to that part of the forest, and I don't camp alone anymore. Something out there marked me as an intruder in its territory, and it did so in the most primal, humiliating way possible. I still go over the details in my head, wondering if there was something I could have done differently. Should I have made myself known? Should I have tried to communicate somehow? Or would that have escalated the situation into something even worse? I don't have answers to those questions. All I know is that there's something out there in the Olympic National Forest that doesn't appear in any wildlife guide. Something that walks on 2 legs and marks its territory like no animal I've ever heard of. And sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I swear I can still smell that distinctive odor, just faintly. A reminder that the wilderness holds secrets we're not meant to understand. Story 2. I never believed in this stuff before. I was always the skeptical one in my family, the guy who needed proof for everything. But what happened to me back in 2009 completely changed how I see the world. I've barely told anyone about this because honestly, who would believe me? But I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here has experienced something similar. I was visiting my sister Jen in Washington State that spring. She lives in this small town about 30 minutes from Seattle, surrounded by dense forest and not far from the bay. It was supposed to be a relaxing week away from my job in Phoenix, just hanging out, catching up and enjoying the cooler weather. My sister's place backed right up against this thick forest with trails running through it. She always talked about how beautiful they were, especially in spring when everything was green and blooming. On my 3rd day there, Jen had to drop my nephew Tyler off at school and then run some errands. It was a gorgeous morning, sunny but cool, with that fresh spring air that makes you want to be outside. I noticed an old Trek mountain bike leaning against the side of her garage and decided to explore those trails she was always talking about. Jen mentioned there was a path that supposedly went all the way to the bay, about 6 or 7 miles through the woods. Seemed like the perfect way to spend the morning. The bike was a bit rusty and the gears stuck occasionally, but it was rideable. I filled a water bottle, grabbed my phone, though the reception out there was terrible, and headed off down the trail behind her house. The first mile or so was pretty well maintained, packed dirt with occasional gravel patches, wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side. I passed a couple of dog walkers early on, but after that I had the trail to myself. About 2 miles in, the path narrowed and started to get rougher. The trees grew denser overhead, creating this green tunnel effect. The temperature dropped noticeably in the shade, and I could hear birds and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. I remember thinking how different this was from the desert landscape I was used to. Everything was so alive and green. I'd gone maybe 3 or 4 miles when the trail curved sharply around a huge fallen cedar. As I rounded the bend, I stopped pedaling and just froze. About 50 yards ahead of me was what I initially thought was a bear standing on its hind legs. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall and covered in thick black hair. My mind immediately went to black bear, even though I knew they weren't usually that large. But something felt off. The way it was standing was too upright, too balanced. I slowed the bike to a complete stop, trying to process what I was seeing. The creature was facing away from me, seemingly focused on something in the trees to my right. That's when I noticed its proportions were all wrong for a bear. Its legs were long, with visible knee joints. Its shoulders were broad, but distinctly humanoid, tapering down to a narrower waist. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I thought about turning around quietly, but some stupid part of me wanted a better look. I needed to know what I was seeing, so I slowly got off the bike, letting it rest against my leg, and just stood there watching. That's when it turned around. I've spent years trying to accurately describe its face, but words don't really do it justice. It wasn't human, but it wasn't exactly ape-like either. It was something unique. The face was dark, with deep-set eyes under a prominent brow ridge. Its nose was broad and flat, and its jaw was massive. But the eyes, that's what hit me hardest. They were dark, but clearly intelligent, alert, and very much aware of me. We stared at each other for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Then its lips pulled back, revealing yellowish, chipped teeth that looked powerful enough to crush bone. Some were crooked, some worn down like it had been chewing on hard objects for years. It made this sound, not quite a growl, more like a muffled hiss, almost like an incredibly loud cat's purr that vibrated through the air between us. Its body language changed immediately. It turned to face me fully, and that's when I got a clear view of just how muscular this thing was. Even beneath the thick hair, I could see the definition in its chest and arms. This wasn't some guy in a costume. The muscle moved naturally under the skin and hair. Its hands, or paws, or whatever they were, looked powerful enough to tear a log apart, with thick fingers and what appeared to be dark, curved nails. I was completely frozen. My brain was frantically trying to make sense of what I was seeing, cycling through every animal I knew of, but nothing matched. This was a Sasquatch, a freaking Bigfoot, standing right there in front of me, and it did not look happy to see me. When it took a step forward, reality snapped back into focus. I scrambled onto the bike, nearly falling in my panic. I heard another sound behind me, deeper this time, almost like a grunt followed by a low rumble. I didn't look back. I just started pedaling as hard as possible, my feet slipping off the pedals twice in my rush. That's when I heard it coming after me. The sound of something large moving quickly through the forest is unlike anything else. Branches breaking, heavy footfalls hitting the ground, the rustling and cracking of undergrowth. It was gaining on me, and the trail was too rough for me to pick up real speed. I could feel the vibrations through the ground with each of its strides. I risked a single glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. The thing was running on two legs, its long arms swinging with each stride, covering ground with shocking speed. It was maybe 30 yards behind me and closing fast. Its movement was smooth, efficient, nothing like the awkward lope you'd expect from something that large. I've never pedaled so hard in my life. The trail dipped downhill, giving me a brief advantage as gravity helped increase my speed. I flew over roots and rocks, nearly wiping out twice as the old bike's shocks struggled to absorb the impact. My lungs were burning and sweat was running into my eyes, but the sound of pursuit kept me going. I hit a straight section of trail and pushed even harder, praying I could outpace it. For about half a mile, this nightmarish chase continued. Then, suddenly, the sounds of pursuit stopped. I kept pedaling frantically, afraid to look back again. But after another minute of silence, curiosity overcame fear. I glanced over my shoulder and saw nothing but empty trail. I didn't slow down, though. I kept pushing forward, determined to get back to civilization. That's when I heard it, a series of sharp, deliberate knocks echoing through the forest. It sounded like someone hitting a baseball bat against a tree trunk. Knock, knock, pause, knock. The sound came from somewhere off to my right, deeper in the forest. Then, from much further away to my left, came an answering series of knocks. Different pattern, different rhythm. My blood ran cold as I realized what this might mean. There were more of them, and they were communicating. The knocks were followed by a screech that raised the hair on the back of my neck, high-pitched at first, then dropping into a guttural howl that no human throat could produce. Another howl answered from a different direction. They were coordinating, talking to each other about me. I hit a fork in the trail and took the path that seemed more well-traveled, hoping it would lead back toward my sister's neighborhood. The bike's chain slipped as I rounded a corner, causing me to lose momentum. I cursed, frantically pedaling to get back up to speed, hearing more knocks and calls in the distance. After what seemed like an eternity, the trail widened again, and I recognized landmarks from earlier. I was heading back toward the populated area. I passed an older couple walking their dog, the first humans I'd seen since this nightmare began. They gave me an odd look as I tore past them, probably because I looked like I'd seen a ghost, covered in sweat, wild-eyed, pedaling like my life depended on it. I didn't stop until I reached my sister's neighborhood. As I turned onto her street, my legs finally gave out. I practically fell off the bike onto her lawn, gasping for air, my heart still racing. I dragged the bike into the garage and went inside, locking the door behind me. When Jen got home an hour later, I was still sitting at her kitchen table, staring at nothing, a cold cup of coffee in front of me. She asked what was wrong, and I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. I mumbled something about getting lost on the trails and being exhausted from the unexpected exercise. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside the window made me tense up. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, those intelligent eyes, the powerful build, the way it moved with such speed and purpose, the coordinated knocks and calls. These weren't mindless animals. They were organized, intelligent beings sharing the forests with us, largely unseen. What haunts me most is wondering what would have happened if it had caught me. Why did it stop chasing me? Was it just territorial, warning me to stay away? Or did it stop because I was approaching areas where it might be seen by others? I'll never know. It's been over 14 years since that day, and I've never gone back to those trails. I've read everything I can find about Sasquatch encounters, and many details match what I experienced. The knocking communications, the incredible speed, the obvious intelligence in their eyes. My sister still lives in that house. When I visit, I stay inside or stick to the neighborhood streets. She thinks I developed some weird aversion to the forest after getting lost that day. Maybe someday I'll tell her the truth, but probably not. Some experiences are too bizarre to share with those closest to you. I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man in a suit. It was something that most people don't believe exists, something that's adapted to stay hidden from human eyes for centuries. I was lucky it let me go. But every time I hear about hikers going missing in the Pacific Northwest, I can't help but wonder if they had an encounter like mine, but weren't fortunate enough to escape. I still don't know why it didn't catch me. It easily could have. Maybe it was just curious. Maybe it was warning me away from something deeper in those woods. Or maybe there's some unspoken agreement between our species to maintain distance. Whatever the reason, I'm grateful to be alive to tell this story. The forest behind my sister's house looks peaceful from her back window. But now I know what's in there, watching and waiting. And no bike ride view, no matter how beautiful, is worth risking another encounter with whatever lives in those Washington woods. Story 3. I don't usually share this story with anyone. Most people would think I'm making it up, or that I was just a kid with an overactive imagination. But what happened that summer when I was 8 still feels so real to me, even 23 years later. My family had just moved from Portland to a remote property in Western Oregon. Dad had gotten tired of city life and wanted somewhere where we could breathe, as he always put it. Mum wasn't thrilled about being so far from civilization, but the house was beautiful, a renovated farmhouse with plenty of space, surrounded by acres of woods and meadows. I remember the day we moved in. While my parents were busy directing the movers, I wandered around exploring our new land. There was an old wooden fence about 200 yards behind the house that marked the official boundary of our property, though Dad said we owned a good stretch beyond that. The fence was weathered and falling apart in places, barely holding together after decades of neglect. That first week I spent every afternoon exploring. I was an only child and didn't know anyone in the area yet, so the forest became my playground and my refuge. Mom would just tell me to stay within shouting distance of the house, but once I discovered what was past that old fence, I couldn't resist going further. It happened on a Tuesday, about 2 weeks after we'd moved in. I remember it was a Tuesday because Mom had gone to her new job orientation, and Dad was working from home but on conference calls all day. He'd given me a walkie-talkie and told me I could play outside as long as I stayed on our property and checked in every hour. I packed a little backpack with a juice box, an apple, and half a peanut butter sandwich. It was late June, warm but not hot. Perfect weather for exploring. I headed straight for the fence, where I'd found a spot with loose boards that I could easily slip through. The woods beyond the fence were different somehow, wilder, more dense. The trees grew closer together, blocking much of the sunlight, and the forest floor was covered in thick moss and ferns. It felt magical, like stepping into another world. I'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes, much further than I'd gone before, when I came to a small clearing with a massive fallen tree trunk stretching across it. I climbed on top, walking along it like a balance beam, when suddenly I heard a strange sound, a sort of whimpering mixed with heavy breathing. I froze, thinking it might be a wounded animal. Dad had warned me about coyotes and even the occasional black bear, so I was suddenly scared. But curiosity got the better of me, and I carefully moved toward the sound, which was coming from behind a cluster of ferns near the base of a huge Douglas fir. That's when I saw it, or rather, saw him. At first, I thought it was a child, maybe a bit younger than me, covered in some kind of weird costume. He was huddled against the tree, knees pulled up to his chest. But as I got closer, I realized this was no kid in a costume. He was about my height, but stockier, covered entirely in shaggy, dark brown fur that looked matted in places. His face wasn't exactly human, but not exactly animal either. A flat, broad nose, deep-set eyes that seemed to shine with intelligence, and a heavy brow that shadowed those eyes. His hands had long fingers with what looked like small black nails or claws. I should have been terrified, but strangely I wasn't. There was something about those eyes. They looked sad, and maybe a little scared. We stared at each other for what felt like forever. Neither of us moved. Then his stomach made a loud growling noise, and for some reason that broke the tension. It was such a normal, human-like sound that it made this strange creature seem less threatening. I remembered the apple in my backpack. Moving very slowly, I set my backpack down and pulled out the apple. His eyes immediately fixed on it, and I saw him shift slightly forward, then hesitate. "Are you hungry?" I whispered, holding out the apple. He didn't respond, but his eyes never left the fruit. I took a few slow steps forward and gently placed the apple on the ground between us, then backed away. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, with surprising quickness, he darted forward, snatched the apple, and retreated back to his spot against the tree. He sniffed it carefully before taking a bite. The way he devoured that apple, it was like he hadn't eaten in days. He made these little grunting noises of satisfaction that made me smile. When he finished, even eating the core and seeds, he looked up at me again. His eyes seemed different now, less fearful, more curious. "I'm Lily," I said softly. He tilted his head slightly, like a dog trying to understand a command. Obviously, he couldn't talk, or at least didn't seem to understand English. But somehow, I felt he knew I was trying to communicate. "Do you live here?" I asked, gesturing around at the woods. He just stared at me, then made a soft hooting sound that wasn't quite like any animal I'd heard before. My walkie-talkie suddenly crackled, making both of us jump. "Lily, check-in time, sweetheart." It was Dad's voice. The creature scrambled back, clearly startled by the electronic sound and Dad's disembodied voice. "It's okay," I said quickly, but he was already retreating into the undergrowth. "I'll come back tomorrow," I called after him, not sure if he understood. "I'll bring more food." I clicked the walkie-talkie. "I'm fine, Dad. Just exploring the woods. I'll head back now." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those intelligent eyes. What was he? Where had he come from? Was he lost? Alone? I remembered stories about Bigfoot or Sasquatch that my uncle used to tell around campfires, but those were always about huge, scary creatures. This was more like a child Sasquatch. The thought was both exciting and confusing. The next morning, I woke up early and snuck into the kitchen. Mom was in the shower, and Dad was still asleep. I opened the pantry and stuffed my backpack with food. 2 apples, a banana, a packet of crackers, and a small jar of peanut butter. I also filled a water bottle, thinking he might be thirsty too. I left a note saying I was exploring the backyard and hurried toward the fence. The whole time, my heart was racing, partly from excitement, partly from fear that he wouldn't be there, that I'd imagined the whole thing. When I reached our meeting spot, there was no sign of him. I felt a stab of disappointment, but decided to wait. I sat on the fallen log and opened my own snack, a granola bar Mum had packed for me. About 10 minutes later, I heard a rustling from the dense undergrowth. Slowly, cautiously, he emerged. He looked exactly as I remembered, though in the clearer morning light, I noticed his fur had reddish highlights in places, and his eyes were a deep amber color. "Hi again," I said softly. "I brought you some food." His nose twitched as he scented the air. I pulled out an apple and rolled it gently toward him. This time he moved forward with less hesitation, picked it up, and retreated only a few steps before eating. And that's how it began. I started visiting him every day, always bringing food. I named him Toby. It just seemed to fit somehow. He never spoke, but he made various sounds. Grunts, hoots, and sometimes a weird chirping noise when he seemed happy. Over the next few weeks, Toby became more comfortable with me. He stopped retreating so far away to eat, and eventually he would sit about 6 feet from me while I talked. I told him all about my life, my school in Portland, my friends I'd left behind, the new house, everything. I have no idea how much he understood, but he always seemed to listen intently. I noticed things about him too. He was incredibly agile, climbing trees with ease. Sometimes he would bring me things. Interesting shaped rocks, unusual feathers, or once a perfectly intact robin's egg, blue as the sky. I'd thank him, and he'd make that happy chirping sound. One day, about 3 weeks into our friendship, I was sitting on our log, telling Toby about the birthday party I was going to that weekend. The daughter of one of Mum's new co-workers had invited me, when I noticed he seemed distracted, his head tilted as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Suddenly he stood up, alert and tense. Then I heard it too, a deep, resonating call that seemed to come from far off in the woods. It wasn't quite a howl, not quite a moan, but something in between. It sounded 3 times, and each time Toby's whole body seemed to vibrate in response. He looked at me, and for the first time, he came close. Really close. He reached out one furry hand and gently touched my arm, his touch surprisingly warm through the fur. His eyes held mine, and I swear there was something like sadness in them. Then he turned and loped off into the forest, moving with incredible speed, disappearing within seconds. "Toby," I called after him, "will you come back tomorrow?" But there was no response, just the rustling of leaves settling back into place. The next day, I waited for hours. Toby didn't come, nor the day after, or the day after that. I kept returning to our spot, leaving apples on the log, hoping he'd at least find them and know I was still his friend. After a week of no Toby, I ventured deeper into the woods than I'd ever gone, calling his name. I found nothing except for a few areas where the undergrowth seemed trampled, as if something large had passed through. But that could have been anything. As summer began to wane, I started to accept that Toby was gone. School was starting soon anyway, and my daily forest adventures would have to end. On my last day of summer freedom, I made one final trip to our meeting spot. I left an apple, a banana, and a jar of peanut butter, his favorite, on the log. "Goodbye, Toby," I said aloud to the silent forest. "I hope you're okay, wherever you are." School started, seasons changed, and life went on. We lived in that house for 10 more years until I left for college. During that time, I never saw Toby again, at least not directly. But there were signs. About 6 months after he disappeared, I found 3 smooth white stones stacked in a perfect tower right by the fence where I used to slip through. No one in my family had put them there, and the precision of the stacking seemed deliberate, not random. A year later, I found a half-eaten apple placed on a tree stump near our meeting spot, the core neatly hollowed out in exactly the way Toby used to eat them. And once, during a heavy thunderstorm when I was 12, I swear I saw a shape outside my bedroom window, just for a second in a flash of lightning. A hunched, furry figure that seemed to be looking in at me. When I ran to the window, whatever it was had gone. Mum and Dad never knew about Toby. Who would believe an 8-year-old claiming to have befriended a young Sasquatch? They would have thought I'd created an imaginary friend, which I suppose is still what most people would think. But I know what I saw, what I experienced. Those intelligent amber eyes, the gentle touch of his fur-covered hand, the happy chirping sounds he made when I brought him peanut butter. I'm 31 now, living in Seattle, working as an environmental scientist. Sometimes my research takes me into remote wilderness areas, and every time I find myself scanning the trees, listening for that distinctive chirp. I've never told my colleagues why I always pack an extra apple and a small jar of peanut butter on field expeditions. Last year, I visited my parents, who still live in that house. During my stay, I hiked out to the old fence line, more out of nostalgia than expectation. The fence is completely gone now, rotted away entirely. As I stood there remembering, I noticed something at the base of a nearby tree. 3 smooth stones stacked in a perfect tower just like before. Next to them sat a perfect pine cone and what looked like a tuft of reddish-brown fur caught on the rough bark. I left an apple before I walked away. Some friendships, no matter how brief or unusual, leave marks on your soul that never fade. I don't know what Toby was or where he went. I don't know if he was separated from his family and they found him again, or if he was just passing through our woods on some migration I couldn't understand. But I do know that somewhere in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, there's a creature who once shared apples and silence with an 8-year-old girl. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I still call his name. Story 4. I've been dirt biking since I was 14. There's nothing like the feeling of the engine vibrating beneath you as you tear through forest trails, the wind in your face and that sense of freedom. I'm now 32 and still ride every chance I get. Most weekends you'll find me out on some trail, usually with a couple buddies, but sometimes alone when no one else can make it. This happened last September, just as summer was fading. I'd planned to meet up with my usual riding group, but one by one they cancelled. Sick kid, overtime at work, wife's birthday dinner, you know how it goes. By Saturday morning, it was just me. I almost stayed home, but the weather was perfect, and I'd been looking forward to this ride all week. I decided to explore some old logging roads, about 40 miles outside of town. It's a pretty remote area in the Cascades that I'd only been to once before, but with a group. The main trail is well established, but there are dozens of offshoot paths that snake through the dense forest. Perfect for a day of exploration. I loaded up my KTM 350 EXCF, packed extra water, some energy bars, basic tools, and my phone, though I knew service would be spotty at best. I always bring a small first aid kit too. Learned that lesson the hard way after a bad spill a few years back. The drive to the trailhead took about an hour. I passed maybe 3 cars on the final stretch of gravel road, and by the time I parked at the small clearing that serves as an unofficial lot, there were no other vehicles around. Not unusual for this area, especially on an overcast day when most riders would choose more popular spots. I geared up, did a quick check of my bike, and hit the trail around 10 in the morning. The first hour was fantastic. The main logging road was rough but rideable, climbing steadily through thick pine forest. The smell of dirt and pine needles filled my helmet as I navigated around ruts and rocks. I felt that familiar rush of adrenaline and freedom that keeps me coming back to these woods. Around 11:30, I reached a fork I didn't remember from my previous trip. The main path continued upward, but a narrower trail branched off to the right, descending slightly. Something about it looked inviting, less traveled but still clear enough to follow. I decided to explore it, figuring I could always turn back. This is where things started to get weird, though I didn't realize it immediately. The trail was rougher than it had appeared from the fork, with more fallen branches and overgrowth. I had to slow down considerably, picking my way through obstacles. The forest around me thickened, with taller trees closing in overhead. The light changed, filtered through the dense canopy, casting everything in a greenish-gray glow. After about 15 minutes on this path, I noticed something odd. The forest had gone completely silent. Now, if you spend time in the woods, you know they're never truly quiet. There's always something. Birds calling, squirrels rustling through leaves, wind in the branches. But suddenly, there was nothing. Just the sound of my engine and the crunch of tires on dirt. I remember thinking it was strange, but didn't dwell on it. Maybe I'd disturbed the wildlife. I continued down the trail, which had narrowed even further, requiring all my focus to navigate. The silence persisted, making me increasingly uneasy. I can't explain exactly why, but it felt wrong somehow, like the forest was holding its breath. After riding for another 10 minutes or so, I came around a bend and spotted something unusual on the side of the trail. From a distance, it looked like a whitish-grey rock or maybe trash someone had dumped. I slowed down as I approached, curious. When I was about 15 feet away, I realized it wasn't a rock. It was bone. A large bone, partially covered by fallen leaves and dirt. I stopped my bike and killed the engine. The sudden absence of noise was startling. No birds, no insects, nothing but an oppressive silence that seemed to press in from all sides. I took off my helmet and hung it on the handlebar, then walked over to investigate. What I found made me freeze in place. It wasn't just a bone, it was a skull. And not just any skull. This thing was massive, easily twice the size of a human head. At first I thought maybe it was a bear, but the shape was all wrong. It had similarities to a human skull, the general structure, the eye sockets positioned at the front rather than the sides, but with crucial differences that made my skin crawl. The jaw was incredibly thick and robust, with teeth designed for crushing rather than tearing. The eye sockets were enormous, deep-set under a heavy brow ridge. The most distinctive feature was a slight sagittal crest running along the top, something you'd see in primates but not humans. I'm not a biologist or an anthropologist, but I've watched enough nature documentaries to know this wasn't from any animal native to these woods. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a mountain lion, wasn't any kind of deer or elk. The structure was unmistakably primate-like, but far larger than any known primate in North America. A chill ran through me despite the mild temperature. I crouched down for a closer look, not touching it, but examining it from all angles. The skull was weathered but not ancient. Some of the sutures were still visible, and there were even a few strands of what looked like coarse, dark hair caught in crevices near the base. That's when I felt it, the sensation of being watched. It wasn't subtle either. It was that primal, neck-tingling feeling that something with intelligence has its eyes fixed on you. I straightened up slowly, trying to appear casual while scanning the surrounding forest. The trees stood like silent sentinels, branches barely moving in the non-existent breeze. The underbrush was thick in places, providing plenty of hiding spots. I saw nothing at first, just more trees, shadows, and silence. Then I caught movement at the corner of my eye, just a slight shifting of shadows about 50 yards into the trees. I turned my head slowly, trying to focus without making sudden movements. For a moment, I convinced myself it was nothing, just my imagination working overtime because of the strange skull. Then I saw it again. Something large moved behind a cluster of pines, just a glimpse of dark mass shifting position. Whatever it was stood much taller than a man, maybe 7 or 8 feet with broad shoulders. My mouth went completely dry. I remember swallowing hard, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to call out, to see if it was maybe just another hiker or hunter, but something stopped me. Some deep instinct told me to stay quiet, to not draw attention to myself, even though I knew I'd already been spotted. I took one step backward toward my bike, then another. The shape didn't move, but I felt its attention intensify, like a physical pressure against my skin. I've been in the woods my whole life, encountered black bears, even a cougar once, but never felt anything like this. This awareness, this intelligence focused entirely on me. When I reached my bike, I carefully put on my helmet, trying to make slow, deliberate movements. My hands were shaking so badly I fumbled with the chin strap. The whole time, I kept glancing toward where I'd seen the movement, but there was nothing visible now, just dense forest. I started the engine, and the sound seemed deafening in the unnatural quiet. I swear the trees themselves flinched at the intrusion. As I prepared to turn around, I heard it, a sound that still haunts me when I'm alone in quiet places. It was a knocking sound, like wood striking wood, but with rhythm and purpose. 3 distinct knocks, then silence, then 3 more. It came from deeper in the forest, beyond where I'd seen the movement. Then, from the opposite direction, another series of knocks answered. Whatever was watching me wasn't alone. I didn't wait around to see what would happen next. I gunned the engine and executed the fastest three-point turn of my life on that narrow trail. As I accelerated back the way I'd come, I glanced in my mirror and saw something step onto the trail where I'd just been. I only caught a glimpse, a massive dark silhouette standing upright. It didn't chase me, just stood there watching me flee. I rode faster than was safe on that rough trail, branches whipping against my helmet and arms as I pushed through overgrown sections. The whole ride back to the main logging road is a blur in my memory. I remember constantly checking behind me, expecting to see something massive crashing through the trees in pursuit, but nothing followed, at least nothing I could see. When I finally reached my truck, I loaded my bike with record speed and got the hell out of there. My hands shook the entire drive home. I kept replaying what I'd seen in my mind, the skull, the silhouette, those deliberate knocking sounds. I've told a few people about what happened. Most think I found a bear skull and spooked myself into seeing things. One friend laughed and said I'd been watching too many Bigfoot documentaries. My brother-in-law suggested maybe some local kids were playing a prank on trespassers. But I know what I saw. That skull wasn't from any bear. The proportions were all wrong, and bears don't have forward-facing eye sockets like that. And what I glimpsed on the trail wasn't someone in a costume. The movement was too natural, too fluid, and the sheer size of it, in that brief moment I saw it clearly in proportion to the surrounding trees, was impossible to fake. I've gone back to dirt biking since then, but never alone, and never in that area. I stick to popular trails now, places where you can hear other riders and the normal sounds of the forest. I've lost my appetite for solo exploration in remote areas. Sometimes I wonder if I should have taken the skull as proof. Part of me regrets not grabbing it, but another part is glad I left it there. It felt wrong to disturb it, like taking it would have been a violation of something I don't understand. And honestly, I was too scared to go back for it once I felt those eyes on me. I've researched similar encounters online. There are more reports than you'd think from that region. Unexplained knocking sounds, unusual silence in normally active forests, glimpses of large upright figures. Most people are reluctant to use the word Sasquatch or Bigfoot, but that's what they're describing. I don't know what to call what I experienced. I just know that the woods aren't empty, and some trails are best left unexplored. That skull belonged to something that shouldn't exist according to science, and its family or kind is still out there, watching from the trees. I still dirt bike almost every weekend, but I jump at unexpected sounds now, and I can't shake the feeling of being watched even on familiar trails. That day changed something fundamental in how I see the wilderness. It's not just a playground for weekend warriors, it's someone else's territory, and we're just visitors who don't understand the rules. Okay, story 5. I've never been the type to believe in monsters or cryptids. My wife Sarah jokes that I'm the most skeptical person she knows. I'm an accountant from suburban Chicago who likes everything explained and categorized. So what I'm about to share is something I never thought I'd experience, and I still struggle to process it 3 months later. This past August, I took my family on what was supposed to be a normal vacation to Olympic National Park in Washington State. It was me, Sarah, our 13-year-old son Jake, who was glued to his phone the whole drive, and our 9-year-old daughter Emily. We'd rented a cabin for a week, planning to hike, fish, and disconnect from our usual routine. The first 3 days were exactly what you'd expect. Beautiful scenery, fresh air, and the kids complaining about the spotty Wi-Fi. We saw eagles, a few deer in the distance, and Jake even spotted a black bear from the safety of our car, though he was more interested in getting a good photo for Instagram than actually appreciating the wildlife. On the 4th day, we decided to try one of the more remote trails that the cabin owner had recommended. He'd mentioned it was less traveled, but offered some of the best views of the old-growth forest. The trail wasn't even on the official park maps, just a local spot that tourists rarely found. We set out around 9 in the morning. The air was crisp and fog hung between the trees, giving everything this surreal, almost prehistoric feel. The trees were massive. I'm talking the kind that make you feel insignificant, like walking among giants. The forest floor was covered in ferns, moss, and fallen logs that looked like they'd been there for centuries. Emily was excited, running ahead and pointing out different types of mushrooms. Jake was slightly less bored than usual, occasionally looking up from his phone to snap pictures of anything he deemed epic enough for his social media. Sarah kept stopping to identify birds with the little guidebook she'd bought at the visitor center. About 2 hours into the hike, we reached a section where the trail narrowed and dipped into a ravine before climbing back up. The trees were denser here, blocking most of the sunlight. It was cooler, damper, and quieter. The kind of quiet that feels heavy, if that makes sense. We were taking a water break when we heard it, a rustling sound from the undergrowth about 50 yards ahead and to our right. At first, I thought it might be a deer, or maybe even another hiker coming from a different direction, but there was something different about the sound, too heavy, too deliberate. "Dad, what's that?" Jake whispered, actually putting his phone down for once. I raised my finger to my lips, signaling everyone to be quiet. Sarah instinctively pulled Emily closer to her. We stood completely still, barely breathing. The rustling grew louder, and then there was a crack, like a large branch snapping under significant weight. That's when we saw movement through the trees. Something big was moving parallel to the trail, just within the tree line. Then everything happened so fast. There was a sudden burst of activity. A deer sprinted across the trail about 30 yards ahead of us, moving faster than I'd ever seen a deer move. It looked terrified, its eyes wide, nostrils flaring. And right behind it, God, I still get goosebumps thinking about it, something massive burst through the trees after it. My first thought was, bear. But immediately I knew that was wrong. This thing was moving upright on 2 legs. It was tall, easily 8 feet, with broad shoulders and arms that hung lower than a human's should. It was covered in dark, reddish-brown hair that looked matted in some places. The creature moved with a speed that seemed impossible for something that size. In 3 or 4 powerful strides, it closed the gap with the deer. I watched in absolute shock as it reached out with one long arm and grabbed the deer by its hindquarters. The deer kicked and thrashed, but this thing, this creature, swung its other arm in an arc and struck the deer's neck or head. The deer went limp almost instantly. We all froze. I could feel Jake trembling next to me. Emily had buried her face in Sarah's jacket. Sarah was squeezing my arm so tight I later found bruises. The creature stood over the deer, its massive chest heaving. It was facing away from us, hunched over its prey. I remember noticing how the muscles in its back rippled under the hair as it breathed. It was built like a bodybuilder, but with proportions that were just wrong. Too long in the arms, too broad in the shoulders, and then it straightened up. Slowly, deliberately, it rose to its full height and turned its head, scanning its surroundings. That's when I saw its face. It wasn't a mask or a costume. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely animal either. The face had a pronounced brow ridge that shadowed deep-set eyes. Its nose was wide and flat, and its jaw jutted forward more than a human's. But the eyes are what I can't forget. They were dark. I couldn't tell the color from that distance, but they didn't look like animal eyes. There was something behind them, something that was processing and thinking. When it turned its head in our direction, those eyes seemed to lock directly onto us. I've never felt smaller or more vulnerable than in that moment. My whole body was screaming to run, but I knew that would be the worst thing to do. So we stood there, barely breathing, as this creature, this Sasquatch, because what else could it have been, stared in our direction. It didn't make any threatening moves. It didn't bare teeth or beat its chest or any of that movie stuff. It just looked. Assessed. for maybe 10 or 15 seconds that felt like hours. Then, with what seemed like casual indifference, it reached down, grabbed the deer by its neck, and slung the carcass over its shoulder like it weighed nothing. An adult deer, probably 150 pounds, carried like a child's backpack. It turned away from us and walked deeper into the forest, its gait a powerful rolling motion that ate up ground quickly. With each step, branches snapped under its feet and the ground seemed to vibrate. I could track its movement for another 30 seconds or so, just by the sound of vegetation being crushed underfoot. And then it was gone, leaving only silence, and the four of us standing there, unable to process what we'd just witnessed. Did Dad? Emily's voice was barely audible. Was that... I couldn't find words. Sarah was the first to break out of the trance. "We're going back. Now," she said, her voice shaking but firm. We didn't run, but we walked quickly, constantly looking over our shoulders. Nobody spoke for the first 20 minutes of the return trip. Jake, who's usually impossible to separate from his phone, didn't take a single picture or check his messages once. Emily kept close between Sarah and me, occasionally looking up with wide, questioning eyes. It wasn't until we were about halfway back to the cabin that Jake finally broke the silence. "That was a Sasquatch. We just saw Bigfoot kill a deer." He said it so matter-of-factly that I almost laughed, despite the adrenaline still coursing through my system. But he was right. There was no other explanation that made sense. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a suit. It moved with too much natural power, had too much mass, too much presence. When we got back to the cabin, we all sat at the kitchen table, still in our hiking clothes, and tried to process what we'd seen. Emily was full of questions. Are there more of them? Does it have a family? Why doesn't anybody believe they're real? Can it talk? Is it dangerous? I didn't have answers. Sarah suggested we report it to the park rangers, but after some discussion, we decided against it. Who would believe us? We'd be those crazy tourists who claimed to see Bigfoot. I could already imagine the eye rolls. Jake spent the evening sketching what we'd seen in his notebook. The kid's got talent. He captured the proportions, the way it moved, those eyes. Emily kept asking to see his drawings, then hiding them under a cushion because they scared her, then asking to see them again 5 minutes later. That night, none of us slept well. Every sound from the forest around our cabin seemed amplified. Was that just the wind, or something moving outside? Was that a branch brushing against the roof, or fingers? My rational mind knew we were safe, but primal fear isn't rational. The next morning over breakfast, we had a family meeting. We agreed we'd seen something extraordinary, something most people go their whole lives without witnessing. We also agreed that telling people would likely result in ridicule or concern about our mental health. "It's our secret," Emily said solemnly, and we all nodded. We stayed at the cabin for the remaining 3 days of our vacation, but we didn't go back on that trail. We stuck to the popular, well-traveled paths where there were always other hikers within shouting distance. I kept thinking I caught glimpses of movement in the tree line, but it was probably just my imagination working overtime. On our last night, as we sat around the fire pit outside the cabin, Jake asked the question that had been on all our minds. "Do you think it knew we were watching it?" I thought about those intelligent eyes, the way they had seemed to look right through us. "Yes," I said finally. "I think it knew exactly what it was doing. I think it decided we weren't a threat or worth bothering with. Or maybe it was showing us something," Sarah suggested quietly. "Maybe it wanted to be seen." I don't know if that's true, but the idea has stuck with me. There was something almost deliberate about the whole encounter, like we'd been allowed to witness something few humans ever see. We've been back home for 3 months now. Life has returned to normal. Work, school, soccer practice, dinner around the table. But none of us are the same. Jake researches cryptid sightings in his spare time now, instead of playing video games. Emily has filled her bookshelf with every Sasquatch book the library has. Sarah has started hiking more, even as the weather gets colder. And me, I've become less certain about everything. If something like that can exist, largely undocumented despite centuries of stories and sightings, what else might be out there that we don't understand? It's humbling and terrifying all at once. I still see those eyes in my dreams sometimes, intelligent, wild, ancient. They seem to look at us with neither fear nor aggression, just awareness, recognition maybe, like it was thinking, I see you seeing me. We agreed as a family not to talk about it publicly, but I needed to write it down somewhere, to tell someone. So here I am, sharing it anonymously. I don't need you to believe me. I'm not trying to convince anyone or start a debate about whether Sasquatch exists. I know what I saw. My family knows what we experienced. And that creature knows we were there, watching it hunt, frozen in fear and wonder on that foggy morning in the ancient forest. I used to think people who claimed to see these things were attention seekers or just confused about what they'd actually witnessed. Now I wonder how many others are like me, ordinary people, who experience something extraordinary and keep it to themselves because the truth sounds too unbelievable. All I know for sure is that deep in those old forests, there are still mysteries. And sometimes, if you're very lucky or maybe unlucky, those mysteries reveal themselves to you, if only for a moment. And you're never quite the same afterward. Story 6. It was summer, July 2008. My family and I were driving back from my Aunt Linda's house in rural Pennsylvania. She lives way out in this little town, surrounded by forest. The kind of place where you can actually see the stars at night because there's no city lights for miles. We'd gone there for my cousin's birthday party, which had run late, really late. By the time we left, it was already past 11 at night. I remember because I was fighting to stay awake in the back seat of our old Chevy Tahoe. My little sister Emma had already fallen asleep beside me, her head tilted at this uncomfortable angle that would definitely give her a neck cramp later. I was determined to stay awake though. I always hated sleeping in the car. The drive back to our house was about 2 hours, mostly on these winding back roads that cut through dense forest. My dad knew a shortcut that would save us about 30 minutes, but it meant taking this narrow, barely maintained road. I remember it didn't even have any streetlights, just our headlights cutting through pitch blackness, trees crowding in on both sides. I was half dozing, forehead pressed against the cool window glass, watching the endless trees rush by. My mum and dad were talking quietly in the front seat about some adult stuff, bills or work or whatever. The radio was playing softly, some oldies station my dad always listened to. I remember Hotel California was just ending when everything changed. "Oh my God, stop!" My mum's voice jolted me fully awake. I felt the car lurch as my dad slammed on the brakes. We skidded slightly on the asphalt before coming to a stop right in the middle of the road. "What? What is it?" My dad sounded annoyed at first, but then his voice changed. What the hell was that? I unbuckled my seatbelt and leaned forward between the front seats. What's happening? My mom was breathing fast, one hand pressed against her chest. Something ran across the road, right in front of us. Something big. "A deer?" my dad asked, squinting through the windshield. My mom shook her head. "No, no way. It was on 2 legs, running upright." Her voice had this strange, tight quality I'd never heard before. My dad reached over and turned off the radio. The silence felt heavy. All I could hear was my mum's breathing and Emma still sleeping, oblivious, in the seat beside me. "Are you sure?" my dad asked. He leaned forward, peering into the darkness beyond our headlights. "I know what I saw, Dave," my mum snapped. She was really freaked out. It was tall, taller than a person, and it moved fast. I pressed my face back against my window, trying to see something, anything in the darkness. The woods seemed even more menacing now, like the trees themselves were watching us. That's when I saw it. Just beyond the tree line on the right side of the road, maybe 30 feet from our car, something was standing there. At first, I thought it might be a tree trunk or a weird shadow, but then I realized it was moving slightly, breathing. "Dad," I whispered, not taking my eyes off the figure. "Dad, there's something over there." My dad turned around to look at me, then followed my gaze out the window. I heard his sharp intake of breath. Jesus Christ! The creature was huge. I'm not exaggerating when I say it had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe even taller. It was standing just behind this large pine tree, partially hidden, but I could clearly see its outline against the slightly lighter background of the forest. It was covered in what looked like dark fur or hair, not like a bear's coat, but longer, shaggier. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Its arms hung down way too low, almost to its knees. What really got me, though, what still gives me chills when I think about it, was the feeling of being watched. I couldn't make out its face clearly in the darkness, but I absolutely knew, it was looking right at me. Not just at our car, but at me specifically. I felt pinned by its gaze, like a bug under a microscope. No one in the car spoke. My dad had turned off the engine when we stopped, and now the only sound was our breathing. Even the normal forest noises, crickets, frogs, whatever, had gone completely silent. It was like the whole world was holding its breath. "Dave," my mom whispered, start the car right now." My dad didn't move. He was still staring at the creature, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The thing shifted its weight, and I could see more of its body now. Its chest was massive, way broader than any humans could be. And there was this weird smell that somehow seeped into our closed car, like wet dog and something rotten and earthy all mixed together. For what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds or so, we all just sat there, frozen. The creature and us, locked in this bizarre standoff on a deserted forest road at midnight. Then it moved. It was so fast I almost couldn't track the movement. 1 second it was standing there watching us, and the next it had turned and was moving through the trees. But not like a person would move. More fluid somehow, covering ground in these long, powerful strides that seemed impossible for something that size. The branches didn't even seem to slow it down. It just vanished into the darkness. My dad finally snapped out of it. He fumbled with the keys, started the engine, and hit the gas so hard I was thrown back in my seat. He didn't slow down for the next 20 minutes, taking curves way too fast, constantly checking the rearview mirror. Emma finally woke up from the rough ride. "Why are we going so fast?" she mumbled, rubbing her eyes. No one answered her. When we got home, my parents acted weird. They didn't talk about what happened, not really. My dad just said, "Let's not mention this to anyone, okay? They'll think we're crazy." I couldn't sleep that night. I kept replaying it in my head, seeing that massive figure standing in the trees, feeling those invisible eyes locked on me. Every shadow in my room seemed to hide something watching me. The next morning, I tried to talk to my mom about it. She was making breakfast, acting like nothing had happened. "Mom, what was that thing we saw last night?" She cracked an egg into the pan with more force than necessary. "Probably just a bear standing funny. The darkness plays tricks on your eyes." But I knew she didn't believe that. I saw her face when it was happening. She was terrified. I went online and started researching. I typed in things like tall, hairy creature woods, Pennsylvania, and two-legged animal forest. And that's when I found the term Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it. I read account after account of people seeing something exactly like what we'd seen. The height, the long arms, the way it moved with this impossible speed and grace through dense forest. Some people had videos or photos, but they were always blurry or dark, nothing concrete. My dad refused to discuss it completely. Whenever I brought it up, he'd change the subject or tell me to stop with the wild imagination. But I noticed he stopped taking that shortcut through the woods. And for months afterward, he kept the baseball bat by our front door at night. Emma doesn't remember anything. She slept through the whole thing. Sometimes I envy her for that. I'm 27 now. I've told a few close friends over the years, but most of them think I'm just telling a creepy campfire story, or that I've convinced myself a childhood imagination was real. I get it. I'd probably think the same if someone told me this story. But here's the thing that still haunts me, that feeling of being seen. Not just spotted or noticed, but truly seen by something intelligent, something that knew exactly what it was looking at. There was an awareness in that gaze that felt ancient and calculating. I've gone camping many times since then. I've been in forests all over the country, and I've never seen anything like it again. But sometimes when I'm in the woods and it gets quiet, that special kind of quiet when even the birds stop singing, I get this crawling sensation on the back of my neck, like something's watching me from just beyond the tree line, waiting. I've read scientific explanations, misidentified bears, optical illusions, overactive imaginations. But none of that explains the way it moved or why my dad, the most rational, no-nonsense person I know, was so shaken he couldn't speak for hours afterward. There's one detail I haven't shared with anyone until now. When the creature turned to leave, just before it disappeared into the trees, I swear it made a gesture. It raised one of those impossibly long arms and pressed what looked like a hand against its chest, almost like acknowledging me, recognizing me. It was such a human movement from something so clearly not human that it made my blood run cold. I've tried to convince myself over the years that it was just a shadow or a branch moving in the wind, but deep down, I know what I saw. I don't know why I'm finally writing this all down now. Maybe because my parents recently moved away from Pennsylvania to Florida, and somehow that feels like closing a chapter. Or maybe because last week I was driving home late from a friend's house, taking a shortcut through some woods, and I found myself slowing down at every crossing, scanning the trees with my high beams. All I know for certain is that for one bizarre moment on a summer night 15 years ago, something unknown looked out from the wilderness and saw me. And somewhere deep in those woods, I believe it's still there, watching, waiting, remembering our encounter just as clearly as I do. I still can't drive on dark forest roads without checking my rearview mirror constantly. Not for other cars, but for something large moving just beyond the reach of my tail lights. Something that might recognize me again if our paths ever cross. Story 7. I've been hesitating to write this down for weeks now. Every time I sit down to type it out, my hands start shaking and I have to walk away from my computer. But I need to get this off my chest. I've always been skeptical about Bigfoot stories. I'm a logical guy. I work in IT. I believe in science and rational explanations, or at least I did, until last month. It happened on September 23rd. I'd taken a week off work to go on my annual fishing trip. I do this every fall. It's my way of decompressing before the holiday season hits. Usually, I go with my buddy Mark, but he bailed last minute because his kid got sick. I debated cancelling, but I'd been looking forward to this trip for months. So I decided to go solo. I chose Lake Chisholm, about 3 hours north of where I live. It's not on many maps, and most locals don't even talk about it much. That's what I loved about it, the isolation. The lake sits in this valley surrounded by dense forest, mostly pine and oak. There's no cell service, no amenities, just pure wilderness. It's the kind of place where you can go days without seeing another human being. I arrived early in the morning and set up my campsite about 30 yards from the shore. It was a perfect spot. Flat ground for my tent, a fire pit someone had made years before, and easy access to the water for my small aluminum boat. The weather was fantastic. Mid-60s, clear skies, with that crisp fall feel to the air. The leaves were just starting to turn, splashing the hillsides with reds and golds. The first day and a half were exactly what I needed. I caught a few decent-sized bass, cooked them over an open fire, drank a couple beers, and slept better than I had in months. No emails, no calls, no stress, just me and nature. The third day, the day it happened, started normally enough. I woke up with the sun, made coffee on my portable stove, and had a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal. Around 2 in the afternoon, I decided to go out on the boat again. The fishing had been slow that morning, but I figured the evening might bring better luck as the water cooled. I packed my tackle box, grabbed my rod, a bottle of water, and my small cooler with a few snacks and beers. The lake was calm, almost like glass, perfectly reflecting the trees and sky. I rowed out about 100 yards from shore and started fishing. By 6 o'clock, the sun was getting low, casting long shadows across the water. I'd caught one small bass not even worth keeping, but I wasn't ready to head back yet. There's something magical about being on the water at sunset, the way the light plays across the surface, the way the world seems to quiet down. I decided to stay out a bit longer. That's when I first got the feeling I was being watched. It wasn't obvious at first, just this prickling sensation on the back of my neck. You know that feeling when someone's staring at you in a crowded room? It was like that, but intensified by 1,000. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks after being alone for days. I scanned the shoreline, half expecting to see another camper or maybe a hunter. The tree line was about 50 yards away from where I was floating, a dark wall of pines and thick underbrush. Nothing seemed out of place, but that feeling wouldn't go away. Then I heard it, a loud splash from the direction of the eastern shore, too loud to be a fish jumping. This was something big entering the water. My first thought was a deer or maybe a bear coming down to drink, but when I turned to look, what I saw made my blood run cold. There was movement along the shoreline, something large weaving between the trees. At first, I could only catch glimpses, a dark shape, much taller than any deer, moving with purpose. It was staying partially hidden in the tree line, but I could tell it was massive. The sun was almost gone now, the sky turning that deep purple blue of early evening. I should have headed back to camp then. Every instinct was screaming at me to go, but I couldn't move. It was like I was frozen in place, my eyes locked on that shadow moving through the trees. And then it stepped out. I'll never forget what I saw. Never. This creature emerged from the forest onto the pebbly shore. Even from 50 yards away, I could tell it was enormous. Easily 8 feet tall, maybe more. It had dark, shaggy fur covering its entire body, not like a bear's fur, but longer, more human-like in a way. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, and its arms hung down almost to its knees. But it was the eyes that paralyzed me with fear. They glowed red in the dimming light, not reflected light like you'd see with a deer or coyote, but actual glowing, like embers in a fire pit. They seemed to lock onto me instantly, staring with an intelligence that felt wrong, predatory but worse. Knowing, it just stood there, completely still, watching me. I couldn't even hear it breathing, though it must have been. The only sound was the gentle lapping of water against my boat and the thundering of my own heartbeat in my ears. I don't know how long we stayed like that, locked in some kind of terrifying staring contest. 10 seconds, a minute. Time seemed to stretch and distort. My hands were sweating, my mouth bone dry. I didn't dare look away, didn't dare move, and then it made a sound that I still hear in my nightmares. It wasn't a roar or a scream. It was deeper, more primal. A sort of rumbling growl that seemed to come from the earth itself. It vibrated through the air, across the water, and into my very bones. It felt ancient and wrong, like something humans weren't meant to hear. That sound broke my paralysis. With shaking hands, I yanked the cord on my small outboard motor. It sputtered, died. I pulled again, frantically, tears forming in my eyes. On the third pull, it roared to life, and I spun the throttle as far as it would go, nearly capsizing the boat as I twisted it toward deeper water. I didn't look back for what felt like minutes, focusing only on getting to the middle of the lake, as far from shore as possible. When I finally did glance over my shoulder, it was still there, standing perfectly still on the shore, those red eyes glowing brighter now in the gathering darkness, tracking me. I cut the engine when I reached the center of the lake, about 300 yards from any shore. My whole body was trembling so badly I could barely stay upright. I kept my eyes fixed on those two red points of light on the distant shore. They didn't move. Whatever that thing was, it was still watching me. I stayed in that boat all night. I was too terrified to go back to shore, any shore. What if it was waiting in the trees? What if there were more of them? The temperature dropped into the low 40s, and I had nothing but a light jacket. I huddled in the bottom of the boat, shivering uncontrollably, my eyes never leaving that shoreline. Those red eyes remained visible for hours, unmoving, unwavering. Around midnight, I'm guessing since my watch was back at camp, they finally disappeared. But I still didn't dare go back. Dawn found me half frozen, exhausted and dehydrated, but alive. As soon as there was enough light, I carefully scanned the entire shoreline. Nothing, no movement, no giant creature, nothing out of the ordinary, just trees and rocks and morning mist rising off the water. I started the motor and cautiously approached my campsite. I've never packed up so quickly in my life. I left half my cooking gear, didn't even bother collapsing the tent properly, just grabbed my backpack, my wallet and keys, and got the hell out of there. I practically ran the 2 miles back to where I'd parked my truck. The entire drive home, I kept checking my rearview mirror. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I had to pull over twice because I was hyperventilating. It's been 4 weeks now, and I still can't sleep through the night. I close my eyes and I see those red ones staring back at me. I hear that earth-deep growl. I've told a few friends what happened, but I can see it in their faces. They think I'm making it up, or that I fell asleep in the boat and had a vivid nightmare. But I know what I saw. I've spent hours researching online, reading accounts of similar encounters. Some people call it Sasquatch or Bigfoot. Others have different names for it. I don't care what it's called. All I know is that it was real, it was intelligent, and it was watching me like I was prey. I've been getting these weird phone calls too, just silence on the other end, or sometimes what sounds like heavy breathing. Probably just my paranoia making me jumpy, but part of me wonders if somehow... No, that's crazy. It can't follow me here. It can't know where I live. I sold my fishing gear last week. I'm never going back to Lake Chisholm. Never going fishing alone again, period. I don't care if people believe me or not. I know what I saw out there. Sometimes when I'm driving home late from work and past the wooded areas near my neighborhood, I find myself scanning the tree line, looking for movement, for those eyes. I take a different route now on main roads with streetlights. The rational part of my brain keeps trying to come up with explanations. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs. Maybe the red eyes were just a reflection of the sunset. Maybe I was dehydrated and hallucinating. But then I remember how it moved, how it stood, how those eyes locked onto mine with recognition, how that growl made my very soul shrink back in terror. No bear moves like that. No animal looks at you with that kind of awareness. I tried talking to a therapist about it, but stopped after 2 sessions. She was steering the conversation towards stress-induced hallucinations. I'm not crazy, and I wasn't hallucinating. What I saw was real. Last night, I swear I heard something outside my apartment, a deep, huffing breath, like something large trying to be quiet. I didn't look out the window. Couldn't bring myself to. I just sat in my bathroom with the lights off until dawn, a kitchen knife clutched in my hand. I'm thinking about moving, getting out of this state entirely. I don't know if it would help, but I can't keep living like this. If you've seen something similar, please reach out. I need to know I'm not alone in this. I need to know others have survived encounters like mine. Because right now, every time the sun goes down, I'm back on that lake, staring into those red eyes, wondering if tonight is the night it decides to come find me. I used to be a skeptic, used to laugh at cryptid hunters and conspiracy theorists. Not anymore. There are things in the woods that we pretend don't exist because accepting they're real would mean accepting we're not at the top of the food chain. And after what I saw at Lake Chisholm, I'm convinced that whatever hierarchy we think exists in nature, we've got it all wrong. Those eyes knew me, saw me, and I can't shake the feeling that they're still watching, waiting for me to let my guard down. Story 8. I don't usually share this story with anyone, but something about today, the 5-year anniversary of when Kevin disappeared, has me wanting to finally put it all into words. I've kept this to myself for so long because, well, who would believe me? I barely believe it myself sometimes, but I know what happened. I know what I saw. I live alone in Oak Ridge Valley, in a small farmhouse that belonged to my grandparents. It's beautiful but isolated. My nearest neighbor lives about 4 miles down the dirt road. I inherited this place 7 years ago after my grandmother passed. At first, I was terrified of the isolation, but eventually grew to love the quiet and privacy. My job as a remote technical writer allows me to live here without needing to commute, and honestly, I grew to prefer the solitude to the noise of the city. The day it all started was unusually cold for early October. I remember because I'd spent the morning chopping extra firewood, preparing for what the local farmers were saying would be an early winter. My hands were blistered by late afternoon, and I was exhausted. Just as dusk began to settle, I heard a strange thudding sound coming from my old shed about 50 yards behind the house. Now, I should explain that this shed isn't some cute garden structure. It's a huge, dilapidated wooden building that was once used to store farming equipment. It's maybe 30 feet long and 15 feet wide, with shuttered windows and a roof that leaks when it rains hard. I'd always meant to fix it up but never got around to it. At first I thought it was just a raccoon or maybe a deer that had wandered too close to the property. We get all kinds of wildlife out here, bears occasionally, coyotes, deer, you name it. But this sound was different, heavier, more deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and the baseball bat I keep by the door. I'm not stupid. Living alone in the woods, you learn to be cautious. As I approached the shed, the noises stopped. The silence was almost worse than the sounds had been. Crickets chirped in the distance, but everything else seemed to hold its breath. The shed door was partially open, which struck me as odd because I always keep it latched. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat as I pushed the door wider with the bat. The hinges creaked loudly, and I winced at the sound. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it. If something dangerous was in there, I'd just announce myself. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating old garden tools, stacks of plastic containers, and the rusty tractor parts my grandfather never got rid of. And then, in the far corner, I saw it. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It looked like a massive pile of dark fur, but as my flashlight beam steadied, I realized it was hunched over, trying to make itself smaller. When it turned toward the light, I saw its face. I almost dropped the flashlight. It was like looking at something both human and animal at once. The face was flat and broad, with a pronounced brow ridge. Not quite like a gorilla, but not human either. Dark, intelligent eyes reflected my flashlight beam, and I could see it was breathing heavily. It was enormous. Even hunched over, I could tell it was at least 7 feet tall. Dark brown matted fur covered its entire body. I should have run. Any rational person would have. But something in those eyes held me there. Fear, yes, but also intelligence, awareness, and pain. That's when I noticed the long gash on its arm, still seeping blood that matted the fur around it. It made a soft grunting sound and shifted slightly, revealing more of the wound. It looked deep, maybe from barbed wire or a sharp branch. The creature, because I didn't know what else to call it at that point, seemed to be asking for help in its own way. "You're hurt," I whispered, lowering the bat slightly. In response, it just blinked slowly and continued to watch me. No aggression, no movements to suggest it would attack, just waiting. I backed out of the shed slowly, my mind racing. Once outside, I ran back to the house, locked the door, and paced my kitchen for at least an hour. I should call someone, I thought, but who? The police. They'd think I was crazy. Wildlife management. They'd probably try to kill it. And the more I thought about what I'd seen, the more certain I became that this wasn't just some bear or known animal. This was something science claimed didn't exist. I know how this sounds. If someone told me this story, I'd think they were nuts or pulling my leg. But there was something in those eyes, something I can't fully explain, that made me absolutely certain this was a Sasquatch. Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it. After my panic subsided, I made a decision that probably sounds insane. I gathered some first aid supplies, antiseptic, gauze, bandages, and added some food from my kitchen. Apples, a loaf of bread, and leftover stew from dinner. I put everything into a plastic container and, heart still pounding, walked back to the shed. I didn't go inside this time. I just stood at the door, set the container down where the creature could see it, and spoke softly. I brought you some things for your arm, and food. I'm not going to hurt you. I backed away about 20 feet and waited. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, a massive hand reached out and pulled the container inside the shed. I stood there for maybe 15 minutes, but there was no further movement, no sound. Eventually, I returned to the house, locked every door and window, and barely slept that night. I kept the bat beside my bed and jolted awake at every creak and groan of the old farmhouse. When morning came, I approached the shed cautiously. The container sat empty just outside the door. The food was gone, and surprisingly, so were the bandages and antiseptic. I peered inside, but the shed was empty. I felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. That evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset, I spotted movement at the edge of the woods behind my property. There it stood, partially hidden by the trees, watching me. It raised its injured arm slightly, and I could see a makeshift bandage fashioned from the gauze I'd provided. "You're welcome," I called out softly, feeling ridiculous and amazed at the same time. It nodded, actually nodded, before melting back into the trees. That was the beginning of what became the strangest friendship of my life. Over the next few days, I continued to leave food and fresh bandages in the shed. Each morning I'd find the containers empty, sometimes with the bandages neatly folded and returned if they weren't used. One evening, about a week after our first encounter, I was reading on the porch when I heard heavy footsteps approaching. I tensed, but tried to appear calm as the creature emerged from the tree line. It moved with surprising grace for something so large, and in the fading light I could see its wound was healing nicely. "I'm Sarah," I said, pointing to myself. The creature watched me intently but made no sound. On impulse I added, "I think I'll call you Kevin." It tilted its head slightly as if considering the name, then made a soft, huffing sound that almost seemed like acceptance. From that night on, Kevin became a regular, if somewhat unpredictable, visitor. He never entered the house, seemed to understand boundaries somehow, but would often sit near the shed while I worked in my vegetable garden or hang back at the edge of the clearing while I chopped wood. Once his arm healed completely, I expected him to disappear back into the wilderness. But he didn't. Instead, our strange relationship evolved. He'd sometimes help in his own way, moving heavy logs I couldn't lift or reaching high branches when I was harvesting apples from the old tree behind the house. The first time Kevin brought me a gift, I almost missed its significance. It was a perfectly round, smooth stone, unlike any I'd seen locally. He placed it carefully on the porch steps one morning and retreated to the tree line to watch. When I found it, I held it up, and he made that same huffing sound I'd come to recognize as approval. I started collecting the stones. They varied in color and size, but all had that same impossible smoothness, as if they'd been polished for years. I later learned from a geologist friend, without explaining their source, that some of the stones weren't even from this region, suggesting Kevin traveled far and wide during his periodic absences. Those absences were unpredictable. Sometimes Kevin would disappear for days at a time, and I'd worry about hunters or trappers harming him. But he always returned, often with a new stone, or occasionally something more unusual. A unique piece of driftwood, or once bizarrely, an old compass that somehow still worked. We developed a form of communication that wasn't exactly language, but was effective. Kevin never spoke. I'm not sure if he was physically capable of human speech, but he understood much of what I said. He'd nod, shake his head, or make various vocalizations to express basic ideas. He was particularly skilled with gestures. Winter came, and I worried about where Kevin would shelter during the snow and freezing temperatures. I cleaned out the shed, added insulation to the walls, and put in an old wood stove that had been gathering dust in the basement. Kevin seemed to understand what I was doing and helped in his own way, dragging fallen trees from the forest edge for firewood. That first winter, Kevin stayed primarily in the shed. I'd bring food out twice daily, and we'd sit in comfortable silence as he ate. Sometimes I'd talk about my day or read aloud from whatever book I was into at the time. He seemed to enjoy the sound of my voice, though I have no idea how much he comprehended. By spring, Kevin had become such a normal part of my life that I sometimes forgot how extraordinary the situation was. I'd catch myself casually mentioning something to him as if he were just an eccentric neighbor rather than a creature science claimed didn't exist. I never told anyone about Kevin. Who would believe me? And more importantly, I feared what might happen to him if word got out. People can be cruel to things they don't understand, and the thought of Kevin being hunted or captured for research was unbearable. Summer came, and Kevin spent more time in the forest, though he'd still visit almost daily. He seemed to have a territory that extended far beyond my property, but he always returned. One particularly hot day, I found him sitting in the small creek that ran through the back of my land, clearly enjoying the cool water. I couldn't help but laugh at the sight of this massive mythical creature splashing around like a child. Our second autumn together brought changes. Kevin became more cautious, often freezing at distant sounds I couldn't hear. Hunting season had started, and though my property was posted with no hunting signs, trespassers weren't uncommon. One evening, I heard gunshots in the distance, closer than I was comfortable with. Kevin, who had been sitting near the garden while I harvested the last tomatoes, immediately stood and stared intensely toward the sound. "It's okay," I said softly. "They're probably miles away." But Kevin wasn't reassured. He made an urgent grunting sound, one I hadn't heard before, and gestured for me to go to the house. Then he disappeared into the forest with surprising speed for something so large. Kevin didn't return for 5 days, the longest he'd been away since we'd met. When he finally appeared at the edge of the trees, he seemed agitated. He wouldn't come into the clearing, just stood watching the house. When I approached, he retreated deeper into the forest, then stopped as if waiting for me to follow. Curious and concerned, I followed him about half a mile into the woods to a spot I'd never seen before. There, partially hidden by underbrush, was a crude shelter, branches and leaves arranged against a rock face to create a small cave-like structure. Kevin ducked inside, and after a moment's hesitation, I followed. Inside, I was astonished to find what could only be described as Kevin's home. There were my stones, carefully arranged by color, bits of interesting bark and feathers hung from branches, a collection of metal objects, an old spoon, a rusted key, and what looked like a piece of a watch, were placed in a hollow in the rock wall. But most surprising was a tattered plaid shirt, carefully folded in the corner. It looked decades old, with buttons missing and fabric worn thin. Kevin touched it gently, then looked at me, making a soft, mournful sound. I knew then that Kevin had connected with humans before. Someone, perhaps long ago, had shown him kindness as I had. The realization was both comforting and sad. How long had Kevin been alone? Were there others like him? After showing me his home, Kevin seemed relieved, as if sharing this secret had been important to him. He returned to his normal routine, though he remained more watchful than before. The seasons cycled through again, and our strange friendship deepened. Kevin never became exactly tame. There was always something wild and unknowable about him. But the trust between us was absolute. He would sometimes sit just outside my window during storms, as if checking that I was safe. I'd find fresh berries on the porch steps in summer, carefully picked and arranged. Then came the day that changed everything. It was early spring of our 3rd year together. I woke to find Kevin standing in my yard, more agitated than I'd ever seen him. He was making the urgent grunting sound I'd heard before, pacing back and forth and gesturing to the north. "What's wrong?" I asked, stepping onto the porch. Kevin approached closer than he ever had to the house, his eyes intense. He made the sound again, then mimicked something I couldn't understand, raising his hands above his head and bringing them down sharply. "I don't understand," I said, frustrated by our communication barrier. Kevin tried again, this time making a sound like he was trying to imitate an engine or machinery. Then he bent down and placed one of his smooth stones at my feet, this one larger than the others, a deep blue-black color. He pressed it into my hand, closing my fingers around it with his massive but gentle grip. Then he looked toward the forest, back at me, and made a soft, almost sigh-like sound. Before I could say anything else, he turned and loped into the trees, moving faster than I'd ever seen him move. I called out, but he didn't return. Something in his manner told me this wasn't like his other absences. This felt like goodbye. I waited all day, then the next and the next. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Kevin didn't return. Spring blossomed into summer. Summer faded to fall, and still no sign of Kevin. I hiked to his shelter several times, but it remained untouched, the carefully arranged items gathering dust and leaves. I heard rumors that summer of massive logging operations starting up about 20 miles north of my property. Conservation groups were protesting the destruction of old-growth forest. I wondered if that's what Kevin had been trying to tell me, if the home he'd known for who knows how long was being destroyed. Winter came again, and I kept the shed warm and stocked with food just in case. But the shed remained empty except for my occasional visits to sit and remember. I've since heard stories from hikers in the area, strange sounds in the night, glimpses of something large moving between trees, footprints too big to belong to any known animal. I listen to these stories with a smile but say nothing. It's been 5 years now since Kevin disappeared. I still maintain the shed, still keep it insulated and ready, though I've given up expecting him to return. But sometimes, usually after storms or in the quiet depth of winter, I'll find a perfectly round, smooth stone placed carefully on the shed floor. I've found 7 stones in 5 years, each appearing mysteriously overnight. I keep these stones with the others, my collection now numbering over 30. Each one a reminder that friendship comes in the most unexpected forms, and that there are still mysteries in this world that science can't explain. No one believes me when I try to share this story, so I've mostly stopped trying. But I know what happened. I know what I saw. And somewhere in the vast forests of the Pacific Northwest, I believe Kevin remembers too. Sometimes at night, I sit on my porch and stare into the darkness beyond my yard, wondering if a pair of intelligent eyes might be looking back. And I wonder if Kevin found others like himself, if he's safe, if he's happy. I like to think he is. And I like to think he still remembers the human who bandaged his arm and called him Kevin. Story 9. I've debated whether to post this for years, Most of my family doesn't even talk about it anymore, like we've collectively decided to pretend none of it happened. But I need to get this off my chest, and I figure this community might be one of the few places where people won't immediately think I'm making this up. I grew up on a farm in rural Indiana, about 20 miles from the nearest proper town. It was just us, my parents, me, and my 6 siblings, surrounded by fields, woods, and not much else. Our closest neighbor was over a mile away. We were pretty isolated, which I guess made it easier for them to stay hidden all those years. My parents called them mountain men, though there aren't any real mountains in Indiana. It was just their way of explaining the strange things that would happen around our property. Missing chickens, weird noises at night, footprints that were way too big to belong to any person I'd ever met. My dad would talk about them matter-of-factly, the same way he'd talk about coyotes getting into the chicken coop or foxes taking rabbits. Just another predator to watch out for. I was 7 when I saw one up close. It was early summer, maybe June, and the day had been hot enough that my mum finally agreed to let me and my sister Amy go down to the pond to cool off. Amy was 16 at the time and stuck babysitting me while everyone else was either working in the fields or had gone into town for supplies. Our pond wasn't anything special, maybe an acre across, surrounded by cattails on one side and woods on the other. Dad had built a small wooden dock, and we kept an old paddle boat tied up there. It was this faded blue plastic thing with peeling paint and squeaky pedals, but my siblings and I thought it was the greatest thing in the world. Amy wasn't thrilled about having to take me out. She'd been on the phone with her boyfriend when Mom told her to watch me, and she was in that teenage, sulky mood. But once we got out on the water, even she started to relax. It was peaceful out there, just the sound of crickets, frogs, and the occasional splash of a fish jumping. We'd been pedaling around for maybe half an hour. Amy was trailing her fingers in the water, while I was chattering about school and my friends. You know, the kind of non-stop talking that little kids do. We drifted closer to the wooded side of the pond, where the trees came right up to the water's edge. The shore was maybe 15 feet away. I was in the middle of some story about my teacher when Amy suddenly went completely still. Her face changed in a way I'd never seen before, like all the blood just drained out of it. "What's wrong?" I asked, but she just shook her head slightly, her eyes fixed on something behind me. Before I could turn around, she whispered, "Don't move, Maggie, don't turn around." But of course, telling a 7-year-old not to do something is pretty much guaranteeing they'll do it. I twisted in my seat and looked toward the shore. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just trees and undergrowth. Then I noticed movement. Something was standing behind a large oak tree, partially hidden. I could see a shoulder and part of a head, much higher up the trunk than made sense. Whatever it was tall, really tall. As I stared, it shifted slightly, and I could make out more of its face. That's when I realized I was looking at eyes, dark eyes set in a face covered with reddish-brown hair. The face was wrong. It looked almost human, but stretched out, with a broad, flat nose and a heavy brow ridge. Amy was frozen in her seat, and the paddle boat had stopped moving, since neither of us was pedaling. We were just drifting, slowly rotating in the water as we stared at the creature, and it stared back at us. I remember feeling curious more than scared. I was young enough that I hadn't fully internalized the danger. In my mind, this was probably one of the mountain men my parents talked about. Mysterious, but ultimately just another part of our rural world. "We should go back," I said too loudly. Amy shushed me, but it was too late. The creature reacted to my voice, shifting its position. It stepped slightly away from the tree, revealing more of itself. It was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long arms that hung down past its knees. The reddish-brown hair covered its entire body, though it seemed thinner on the face. Amy was still paralyzed with fear, so I did the only thing I could think of. I started trying to turn the boat myself. My little legs could barely reach the pedals, and the boat moved painfully slowly. That's when it happened. The creature tilted its head back and made a sound that still haunts me today. It was like an owl hoot, but deeper, more resonant, and much louder than any owl could possibly be. It echoed across the water, causing ripples that lapped against our boat. The sound finally snapped Amy out of her trance. "Pedal, Maggie," she whispered urgently. "Pedal as fast as you can." We both started pedaling frantically, swinging the boat around to head back toward the dock. I kept looking over my shoulder, unable to tear my eyes away from the shore. The creature had fully emerged from its hiding spot now. It walked down to the water's edge with an oddly graceful gait despite its size. Then it did something I still can't explain. It knelt at the edge of the water, bent forward, and dunked its head completely upside down into the pond. It held this bizarre position for several seconds before pulling its head out, water streaming from its hair. By this point, we were halfway back to the dock, pedaling so hard that the plastic boat's mechanisms were creaking in protest. I kept my eyes on the creature the whole time. It watched us from across the water, making no attempt to follow. As we neared the dock, the creature turned and started moving back into the woods. But it didn't walk normally. It moved with this strange skipping motion, placing one foot directly in front of the other, like it was walking a tightrope. I'd seen that pattern before, in the mysterious single-file footprints my brothers would sometimes find along the edge of our property. We crashed into the dock hard enough to make Amy fall forward, banging her knee. She scrambled out of the boat, dragging me with her. We ran all the way back to the house, where Amy told our parents what happened. Dad went down to the pond with his rifle, but found nothing except some large, human-like footprints at the water's edge, where we'd seen the creature standing. Mum was upset, but tried to downplay it, saying it was probably just some vagrant living in the woods. But I knew better. We all did, really. My parents had been dealing with these things for years, trying to convince themselves they were just unusually large, hairy people who happened to live wild in the woods. Life went on. My parents warned us to be more careful, to always go out in groups, to come inside before dark. But farm life doesn't stop for scary encounters. There were still animals to tend, crops to manage, and chores to do. For a few years, things were relatively quiet. We'd hear the occasional whooping calls at night far off in the distance. Sometimes we'd find strange tracks around the property. Once or twice a year, a chicken would disappear despite the locked coop. But we never had another close encounter until I was 13. That's when Dad decided to diversify and got the idea to raise goats. He thought it would be a good way to control some of the overgrowth at the edges of our property, while also providing milk and eventually meat. He built a pen about 100 yards from our house, at the point where our cleared land started to give way to woods. Mom wasn't thrilled about the goats. She said they'd attract predators, and she was right, just not the kind she was thinking of. We started with 6 nanny goats, all pregnant. Within a month, we had 15 goats total, 6 adults and 9 kids. They were cute, especially the babies, and I took to helping Dad with them every morning and evening. It was in early spring when it happened. I remember because the weather had just started to warm up and the trees were budding with new leaves. I woke up early that Saturday morning, planning to help Dad with the goats before my other chores. My window faced the goat pen, and as I was getting dressed, I noticed something strange. The goats were all clustered at one end of their pen, as far from the woods as they could get. Even from the distance, I could see they were agitated, pacing, bleating, butting heads. I rushed downstairs and out the back door, not even stopping for breakfast. As I jogged toward the pen, the goats' distress became more apparent. They were making sounds I'd never heard before, high-pitched, frantic bleating that sounded almost like screaming. I was about 50 yards from the pen when I stopped dead in my tracks. There was something moving along the tree line. No, not something. Several somethings. Large figures, at least 3 of them, moving with that same strange gait I remembered from years before. Fear rooted me to the spot. I couldn't move, couldn't call out. I just stood there, watching as these creatures circled the far side of the goat pen, staying just inside the tree line where the shadows were deepest. The goats were in a complete panic now, throwing themselves against the fence on the side nearest our house. One of the mountain men suddenly broke from the trees, moving with shocking speed for something so large. It vaulted over the 5-foot fence like it was nothing, landing inside the pen. That finally broke my paralysis. I screamed for my father, for anyone at the top of my lungs. The creature's head snapped in my direction, and for a heartbeat, our eyes met across the distance. I will never forget that gaze, intelligent, calculating, and utterly inhuman. My scream brought my father bursting out of the barn where he'd been working. He had his shotgun with him, and when he saw what was happening, he fired a shot into the air. The loud crack echoed across our property. The creature in the pen didn't flee immediately. Instead, it reached down with incredible speed, grabbed one of the baby goats, and then cleared the fence again in a single bound. The 2 others emerged from the tree line, and I could see now that they were carrying something too. More of the baby goats. Dad fired another warning shot, and they retreated into the woods, moving with that peculiar single-file skipping gait. The whole incident couldn't have taken more than a minute or 2. We rushed to the goat pen. Inside, it was chaos. Several of the adult goats were injured from throwing themselves against the fence. One nanny goat lay motionless on the ground, her neck twisted at an impossible angle. She was dead, killed not by claws or teeth, but by hands strong enough to snap her neck with a single twist. 4 of the 9 baby goats were missing. Dad grabbed his rifle and whistled for our dogs, determined to track the creatures. Mum was frantic, begging him not to go into the woods, saying they'd kill him too if they could break a goat's neck that easily. I just stood there, staring at the dead goat and trying to process what I'd seen. These weren't the shy creatures from my childhood pond encounter. These were predators, coordinated and calculating, that had planned and executed a raid on our livestock. Dad eventually relented to Mum's pleas, but he spent the rest of the day reinforcing the goat pen with higher fencing and installing floodlights that would trigger with motion sensors. That night, nobody slept. We took turns keeping watch, rifles loaded. The creatures didn't return that night or the next, but something had changed. Mom couldn't stop talking about moving, about selling the farm and finding a place closer to town. Dad resisted at first. The farm had been in his family for generations, but after a week of jumping at every sound and sleeping in shifts, even he started to consider it. The final straw came about 2 weeks after the goat incident. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound I'd never heard before, a chorus of whooping calls, much closer than ever before. They seemed to be coming from all around our house, as if we were surrounded. Mom and Dad were already awake, standing at the windows with the lights off. My siblings huddled together in the hallway. We listened as the calls continued for almost an hour, gradually moving farther away until they faded into silence. The next morning, we found footprints all around our house, dozens of them circling the building completely, coming right up to the windows and doors. It was like they were testing our defenses, letting us know they could come right up to where we slept. 2 months later, we moved. Dad sold most of the livestock, rented out the fields to a neighboring farmer, and found a job at a factory closer to Indianapolis. We left the rural isolation for a suburban neighborhood with streetlights and neighbors within shouting distance. I'm in my 20s now, and I've never been back to the farm. Dad still owns the land but refuses to live there. He rents the house out to tenants who never seem to stay longer than a year. They always leave suddenly, breaking their lease and forfeiting their deposit rather than explaining why. I've thought about going back, about setting up cameras to try and get proof of what we lived with all those years. But then I remember the look in that creature's eyes. as it stared at me across the goat pen. That calculating intelligence, that predatory focus. And I wonder if some things are better left undocumented. The mountain men will always be a part of my childhood, an ever-present shadow at the edges of my memory. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I've heard that distinctive whooping call echoing through my suburban neighborhood. And for a moment, I'm 7 years old again, frozen in a paddle boat, watching a creature that shouldn't exist dunk its head into our pond. Story 10. I can't sleep. It's been nearly 16 years since it happened, but every time I close my eyes, I still see those eyes staring back at me. I've never been one to believe in the supernatural or cryptids. I'm just a regular guy who likes hunting, fishing, and spending time outdoors. But what I saw that day in January 2008 near Hardy, Arkansas, changed everything I thought I knew about the world. I'd purchased 40 acres of undeveloped woodland back in 2007 as an investment and occasional getaway. It was remote, heavily forested, and exactly what I wanted. A place to eventually build a cabin, hunt, and escape from city life. That January morning, I decided to drive up to check on the property and maybe scout some locations for a future structure. It was around 10 in the morning when I turned onto the gravel road that led to my land. The weather was unusually mild for January in the Ozarks, probably in the low 50s, with a thin layer of fog still clinging to the hollows and low spots. I was driving my old Ford F-150, taking it slow on the washboarded gravel road. The truck had seen better days, but it was perfect for these backwoods drives. I remember I had the radio off and my window cracked open slightly, just listening to the crunch of gravel under the tires and the occasional bird call. About a mile up the road, I rounded a sharp bend and had to brake suddenly. There, sitting right in the middle of the road, was what I initially thought was a black bear cub. We have plenty of black bears in that part of Arkansas, and my first thought was, where's the mama? I knew better than to get between a mother bear and her cub. I tapped my horn lightly, thinking the noise would send the animal scampering off into the woods. The creature turned toward my truck, and that's when I realized this was no bear. It was sitting upright, with proportions all wrong for a bear. It had a distinctly human-like face, though covered in black fur, and arms that seemed too long for its body. Before I could process what I was seeing, movement from the tree line caught my eye. I'll never forget what emerged from those woods. It was a female, whatever these creatures were. She stood about 7 feet tall, walking upright on 2 legs, with a gait that was fluid yet different from human movement. Her body was covered in dark brown fur, slightly lighter than the juveniles, and yes, she had visible breasts. Not like a human woman's exactly, but definitely mammary glands visible through the fur on her chest. I froze, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I wasn't scared yet, more shocked than anything. This couldn't be real. The female made a series of low grunting sounds, and the juvenile, which I now could see was maybe 4 feet tall, turned and moved toward her. Without hesitation, she reached down, picked up the smaller one, and in one fluid motion placed it on her back, where it clung like a child getting a piggyback ride. The whole interaction took maybe 5 seconds before they disappeared into the thick underbrush. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what I'd just seen. I sat there for maybe 30 seconds, engine idling, trying to convince myself I'd seen a bear and her cub, maybe standing in an unusual way that made them look bipedal. But I knew better. Curiosity eventually overcame my shock. I put the truck in park, grabbed my phone, though reception was non-existent out there, and stepped out. The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked a few steps forward, looking toward where they'd entered the woods. That's when I heard a distinct thunk against the back of my truck. I spun around and felt my heart nearly stop. Standing not 20 feet behind my truck was the largest, most intimidating being I've ever encountered. It was a male of the same species, but much larger than the female, This thing was massive, easily 8.5 to 9 feet tall, with shoulders twice as broad as mine. His fur was primarily black, but with noticeable grey patches around the face and chest, giving him a silverback appearance. His chest was barrel-wide, and his arms hung down almost to his knees, but it was his face I'll never forget. Deeply set black eyes under a prominent brow ridge stared directly at me with unmistakable intelligence. His nose was wide and flat, and his mouth was set in what I can only describe as a grimace, revealing teeth that looked yellowed but powerful. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably just a few seconds. Then he did something that made my blood run cold. He inhaled deeply, his massive chest expanding, and let out a vocalization I still hear in my nightmares. It started as a deep rumble, almost like a growl, but transformed into something between a roar and a scream that echoed through the forest. It wasn't just loud. It seemed to vibrate through my entire body. Nothing in nature makes a sound like that. Not bears, not cougars, nothing. I knew immediately what I was looking at, even though my brain was desperately trying to deny it. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. And not just one, but a family unit. I slowly began backing toward my driver's door, never breaking eye contact with the creature. He made no move to approach me, but picked up another rock from the roadside, deliberately, with purpose, and held it in his massive hand. The message couldn't have been clearer. This is a warning. Leave. When my back hit the truck door, I fumbled for the handle without looking, nearly ripping the door open in my panic to get inside. I slammed the door shut and locked it, as if a car door lock would make any difference against something that size. The male Bigfoot watched me get in the truck, then deliberately turned and walked across the road toward where the female and juvenile had disappeared. His gait was smooth and confident, nothing like the awkward shuffle you see in those fake videos online. There was power in every movement, and I had no doubt this creature could have torn me apart effortlessly if it had wanted to. I sat there with the engine running, shaking uncontrollably for several minutes. Part of me wanted to turn around and get the hell out of there, but another part of me, the stubborn part, kept saying, "This is your property. You paid good money for it." So against all better judgment, I put the truck in drive and continued up the road at a crawl, constantly scanning the trees on both sides. About a quarter-mile further, I reached the clearing where I'd been planning to eventually build. I stopped the truck and, after a few deep breaths to steady myself, decided to get out again. Big mistake. I'd barely stepped 10 feet from my truck when I heard the distinct sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush to my left. Then another rock, this one larger than the first, hit my truck with enough force to leave a small dent in the tailgate. Another rock sailed past my head, missing by inches, and I didn't wait for the third. I sprinted back to my truck, fumbling with the keys so badly I dropped them before managing to get back inside. I could hear movement in the forest all around me now, branches snapping, undergrowth rustling. Not just from one direction, but from multiple points, as if I was being circled. I finally got the truck started and peeled out of there, gravel flying as I made a hasty three-point turn and headed back down the road. In my rearview mirror, I could swear I saw movement at the edge of the clearing, tall, dark figures, partially obscured by foliage. But I didn't slow down to confirm. The drive back to the main highway was a blur. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the truck on the road. My mind was racing, trying to process what I'd just encountered. These weren't animals, at least not in the way we typically think of animals. The coordinated way they acted, the deliberate rock throwing as warnings rather than direct attacks, the protection of the juvenile, it all pointed to intelligence and social structure. When I finally reached cell service, I pulled over at a gas station and sat there for nearly an hour, trying to decide what to do. Call the police. They'd think I was crazy or drunk. Call a friend. Same problem. I ultimately decided to keep it to myself, at least until I could make sense of it. Over the next few days, I did research online about Bigfoot sightings in the Ozarks. Turns out there have been dozens of reported encounters in that region over the years. Many described similar behaviors, rock throwing, vocalizations, and a tendency to avoid direct confrontation when possible. I found comfort in knowing I wasn't alone, but it didn't make sleeping any easier. I didn't return to the property for 3 months. When I finally did go back, I brought a friend with me, though I didn't tell him why I wanted company, and we stayed in the truck the entire time. We didn't see anything unusual that day, but I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched from the dense forest. I've been back many times since then, and I've never had another direct encounter like that first one. But I've found strange structures deep in my woods, large branches woven together in ways that couldn't be natural. I've heard those vocalizations at dusk, always distant but unmistakable. And twice I've found massive, human-like footprints near the creek that runs through the eastern edge of the property. I still own that land, and I even built a small cabin there eventually. But I never stay overnight alone, and I leave food offerings, usually apples and other fruits, at the edge of the clearing whenever I visit. Call it superstition or respect, but I view myself as a visitor on their territory now, not the other way around. I've told this story to exactly 3 people in my life. My wife, who believes me but prefers not to discuss it. My brother, who thinks I saw bears and let my imagination run wild. And my closest friend, who had his own strange experience in the woods of Washington State years ago and didn't need much convincing. What keeps me up at night isn't fear that these creatures might hurt me. If they'd wanted to, they had every opportunity that day. What haunts me is the realization that we're not alone, that there are intelligent social beings sharing our world that science refuses to acknowledge. It makes me wonder what else might be out there that we're too stubborn or closed-minded to see. I know how this sounds. If I hadn't experienced it myself, I wouldn't believe it either, but I know what I saw. A family, mother, father, child, protecting their territory and each other, just like humans would, just like any intelligent species would. I still have that dent in my truck's tailgate. I've never fixed it. It's my reminder that some things in this world defy explanation, and sometimes it's better to respect the unknown than to challenge it. Story 11. I still have chills just thinking about it. This happened to me and my girlfriend Elisa back in the summer of 1995, and I swear I've never told anyone outside my closest friends because I know how it sounds. But I need to get this off my chest. It was a hot July night in '95, and we'd been dating for almost a year at that point. We were in our mid-20s, young and carefree. We'd gone to this club in Monroe that was popular back then. Can't even remember the name now. Something with an M, I think. Anyway, we'd had a few drinks, nothing crazy, just enough to feel good. Around midnight, Elisa suggested we go somewhere quiet to be alone. I had this old Ford pickup then, nothing fancy but reliable, and we often went to Lake Pearson when we wanted privacy. The lake was about 20 minutes outside town. Not many people knew about this specific spot I found while fishing with my uncle years before. You had to take this unmarked dirt road off the highway and drive about half a mile through some woods before you reached the clearing by the water. During the day, it was a decent fishing spot, but at night, it was completely deserted. The moon was incredibly bright that night, almost full, I think, and there weren't any clouds. You could see everything almost as clear as daylight, just with that silvery blue tint moonlight gives. We parked facing the water, about 30 feet from the shoreline. The truck had one of those camper shells over the bed, and we'd put a foam mattress back there with some blankets and pillows. We often went there just to talk and look at the stars through the back window of the camper. We'd been there maybe an hour, just lying in the back of the truck with the tailgate down, talking about nothing important and watching the moonlight on the water. It must have been around 1 in the morning. The night was weirdly quiet. Usually you'd hear all sorts of critters making noise, but it was almost silent, except for some light wind in the trees. I was mid-sentence when I noticed something moving along the tree line at the edge of the lake to our right. At first, I thought it was just shadows from the trees moving in the breeze, but then I realized it was something solid, something big. "Hey, do you see that?" I whispered to Elisa, nodding toward the movement. She sat up and squinted in that direction. "See what?" "There's something moving over there by the trees." We both watched as this dark figure moved along the edge of the lake, staying close to the tree line. It was walking slowly, deliberately, like it was trying not to make noise. I remember thinking it might be another couple who'd had the same idea as us, but something about the way it moved felt off. The figure kept walking until it reached a small clearing about 75 feet away from us. That's when the moonlight hit it fully, and I felt my blood turn cold. This thing was huge. I'm 6 feet tall, and this creature had to be at least 8 feet, maybe taller. It was completely covered in dark hair, not fur exactly, more like shaggy hair that moved slightly in the breeze. And it was walking completely upright on 2 legs, not like a bear occasionally stands, but fully bipedal like a human. Its body was massive, broad shoulders, thick torso, muscular build that you could see even under all that hair. The arms were unnaturally long, hanging down to about mid-thigh. Its posture was slightly stooped forward, almost like an old man with bad posture, but it was definitely walking upright. I couldn't make out its face clearly from that distance, but the head seemed to sit directly on the shoulders without much of a neck. The head was shaped kind of conical, pointed at the top, not round like a human head. "What the hell is that?" Elisa whispered, her voice shaking. I could feel her grip on my arm tightening. "I don't know," I said, unable to look away. "Maybe a bear." But I knew it wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk like that, not for that long, and not with that kind of gait. The creature suddenly stopped. It turned its head toward us, and even from that distance, I could tell it had noticed us. There was this moment, probably only a few seconds, but felt like forever, where we just froze, staring at each other across the moonlit clearing. Then it changed direction, started walking directly toward us. "Marcus," Elisa hissed, "it's coming this way." I was paralyzed for a moment, watching this impossible thing moving toward us. It wasn't running, just walking with purpose, taking long strides that covered ground quickly, despite its seemingly unhurried pace. That's when survival instinct kicked in. "Get in the cab," I said, already scrambling to my feet. "Now!" We abandoned everything, the blankets, Elisa's purse, a cooler with some beers, and climbed through the little sliding window between the truck bed and the cab. It was a tight squeeze, but fear is a hell of a motivator. I got behind the wheel while Elisa pulled herself through and landed in the passenger seat. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. Elisa was looking out her window, her face pale in the moonlight. "It's still coming," she said, her voice barely audible. "Marcus, it's only about 25 feet away now." I finally got the key in and turned it. The engine sputtered once, twice. My heart nearly stopped, then roared to life. I threw it in reverse, hit the gas harder than I meant to, and we jerked backward, spinning up dirt and gravel. I shifted into drive and took off down the dirt road, not even daring to look in the rearview mirror until we'd gone at least a quarter mile. When I finally did look back, the road behind us was empty. The trees on either side created a dark tunnel, and the moonlight only reached so far. I couldn't see if the thing was following us or not. "Do you see anything?" I asked Elisa, who was twisted around in her seat, staring out the back window. "No," she said, still looking back. "I don't think it followed us." We drove in silence for a while, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I was going way too fast on that dirt road, the truck bouncing and sliding on the loose surface. but I didn't care. I just wanted to get back to the highway, back to civilization. When we finally reached the main road, I pulled over to the shoulder and just sat there, trying to make sense of what we'd just seen. My heart was still pounding in my chest. "What was that thing?" Elisa asked, her voice steadier now, but still tinged with fear. "I don't know," I said honestly. "It wasn't a bear, no way." "Could it have been someone in a costume?" she suggested, but we both knew that was ridiculous. We were miles from anywhere in the middle of the night. Who would be wandering around in a costume that realistic? "Did you see how it moved?" I asked her. "How it walked? That wasn't someone in a suit." We sat there for probably 15 minutes just processing before I felt calm enough to drive home. Neither of us mentioned the blankets and stuff we'd left behind. There was no way in hell we were going back for them, not that night anyway. I dropped Elisa off at her apartment and promised to call her in the morning. Before I left, she grabbed my hand and said, "We're not crazy, right? We both saw the same thing." "We're not crazy," I assured her. Though I wasn't entirely convinced myself, I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept replaying the image of that creature in my head, trying to make it into something explainable. A bear, a moose, a person playing a prank. But none of those explanations fit what we saw. The next day I called Elisa early and we met for coffee. In the daylight, surrounded by normal people doing normal things, it was easier to doubt our experience. Maybe it was the drinks we'd had, maybe it was shadows and moonlight playing tricks. But deep down, we both knew what we'd seen was real. I suggested we go back to retrieve our things in daylight with other people. She refused at first, but eventually agreed as long as we brought my roommate along and didn't stay long. The drive back to the lake was tense. Every shadow in the trees made me flinch. When we reached our spot by the lake, everything looked so ordinary, so harmless. Our blankets were still there in the back of the truck, undisturbed. Elisa's purse was right where she'd left it, nothing missing. It was as if nothing had happened. But then my roommate called us over to the area where we'd first seen the creature emerge from the trees. There, in the soft mud at the edge of the lake, were footprints. Huge footprints, easily 15 inches long and proportionately wide. They were clearly bipedal, with 5 toes, deeply pressed into the mud. They led right up to where we'd been parked and then veered off into the woods. We didn't stick around to follow the tracks. We grabbed our stuff and left, not saying much on the drive back. What was there to say? We had our confirmation, but it only raised more questions. Here's the weird thing. At that time, in 1995, I had never heard of Bigfoot. Sure, I'd seen that famous Patterson film clip once or twice, but it wasn't something I thought about or believed in. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it, wasn't on my radar at all. It wasn't until years later, around 2000 or so, when I happened to catch a documentary about Bigfoot sightings, that everything clicked. They were describing encounters just like ours, the height, the posture, the long arms, the way it moved, and I felt that same cold fear all over again. I called Elisa immediately. We'd broken up by then but remained friends. And she had the exact same reaction when I told her about the show. We started researching, reading accounts from other witnesses, and so many details matched our experience. The way it walked upright, but with a slight stoop. The conical head shape. The silence in the woods before the sighting. Even the fact that it approached us directly once it noticed us. Apparently that's a common behavior, especially with couples or women. Some people have asked me if I was scared it would attack us. Honestly, at the moment, I was too shocked to think that far ahead. Looking back, the creature never showed signs of aggression. It was approaching us, yes, but not charging or making threatening gestures. It seemed more curious than hostile. But when you're faced with something that massive, something that shouldn't exist, you don't stick around to analyze its intentions. I've never been back to that spot on Lake Pearson. I moved away from Louisiana a few years later, and Elisa left too, went to Texas, I think. We don't talk much anymore, but Every now and then, one of us will call the other when there's a new documentary or article about Bigfoot. It's like this weird bond we'll always share. I'm still not sure what to make of what we saw that night. I'm not the type to believe in monsters or cryptids. I'm pretty grounded, pretty skeptical about most paranormal stuff. But I know what I saw. I know it wasn't a bear, wasn't a person, wasn't anything I can explain away with logic. Whatever it was real, it was massive, and for those few terrifying minutes, it was interested in us. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't made it to the truck in time, if the engine hadn't started, if we'd been just a little slower, or it had been a little faster. I don't go camping anymore. I don't fish, don't hike, don't do anything that might put me in a remote area after dark. Call it trauma, call it an abundance of caution, but I can't shake the feeling that there are things out there in the woods that we don't understand, things that should be left alone. And sometimes, on nights when the moon is full and bright like it was back then, I dream about it. Not nightmares exactly, just dreams where I'm back at that lake, watching that dark figure emerge from the trees. And in the dreams, unlike reality, I don't run. I stay and let it approach, curious to finally see its face clearly, to maybe understand what it is. But I always wake up before it reaches me, my heart racing, grateful that in real life we drove away when we did. Story 12. I've never actually told this to anyone except my closest friends. But after reading so many accounts here that echo what happened to me, I feel like I need to share. This happened in August 2009, but I remember it like it was yesterday. I don't expect everyone to believe me, but I swear every word of this is true. I'd been working at this tech company in Seattle for about 3 years, and the stress was really getting to me. 60-hour weeks were normal, and my boss was breathing down my neck about deadlines. I needed to get away, clear my head. Backpacking has always been my escape. I've been hiking since I was a kid, and I've done solo trips all over the Cascades, Olympics, you name it. I know what I'm doing in the woods. I decided on Tenaway Ridge in central Washington. It's not as crowded as some of the more popular spots, and I wanted solitude. The weather forecast looked perfect. Mid-70s during the day, cool at night, no rain. I packed my usual gear, lightweight tent, sleeping bag, water filter, food for 3 days, headlamp, first aid kit, map and compass. I never rely just on my phone. And my hunting knife. I always bring that knife. It was my dad's. I left Seattle around 6 in the morning, drove the 2.5 hours to the trailhead, and was on the trail by 9. The hike started off amazing. The trail climbs through these beautiful old-growth forests before opening up onto these alpine meadows with wildflowers everywhere. I saw a few other hikers early on, but after the first couple of miles, I had the trail to myself. By mid-afternoon, I'd hiked about 8 miles. I found this perfect spot to camp on a high slope with an incredible view of Mount Stewart. Clear sight lines in most directions, flat enough for my tent, and near a small stream for water. I set up camp, filtered some water, made an early dinner, and just sat watching the sunset. It was exactly what I needed. No emails, no phone calls, just peace and quiet. I crawled into my tent around 10 and fell asleep almost immediately. I remember feeling so relaxed for the first time in months. Then something woke me up. My watch said it was around 2 in the morning. I'm usually a deep sleeper, especially after a long hike, so whatever woke me must have been unusual. I lay there in my sleeping bag, completely still, just listening. At first, I heard nothing except the light wind. Then I heard it, this soft scraping sound outside my tent, like something brushing against the outside fabric, but deliberate. Then came the breathing. I'll never forget that sound as long as I live. Heavy, wet-sounding breathing, not like a deer or other animal. This sounded almost human, but deeper, more resonant. Each breath was slow and controlled. My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid whatever was out there would hear it. The scraping continued around the perimeter of my tent, slow and methodical. Then it stopped near the front of my tent. That's when I saw it. The moon was almost full that night, and through the thin nylon of my tent, I could see a shadow pass by. Then the shadow stopped, and I saw the outline of what looked like a hand press against the fabric. But this wasn't a normal hand. The fingers were roughly human-shaped, but they were unnaturally wide and looked incredibly heavy. The hand was massive. It must have been at least twice the size of my own. I could see the fabric depress as whatever it was applied pressure. I slowly, silently reached for my knife, which was in its sheath next to my sleeping bag. My fingers were trembling so badly I could barely grip the handle. I didn't pull it out, just held onto it, trying not to make a sound. Then I heard it, something heavy, shifting its weight. And then, what sounded like something sitting down right outside my tent. I could hear the breathing more clearly now, slow and rhythmic. I swear I could feel the warmth of its breath through the tent wall. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed with fear. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe 15. I didn't move a muscle. I barely breathed. My mind was racing through all the possibilities. Bear? No, the hand was all wrong, and bears don't just sit outside tents breathing. Cougar? Same problem. Some creepy hiker. The size ruled that out completely. Eventually, I heard movement again. Whatever it was stood up. I could hear the shifting weight and what sounded like joints popping. Then came a sound I still hear in my nightmares, a low, rumbling moan that wasn't quite animal and wasn't quite human. It was deep and resonated in my chest, even though it wasn't particularly loud. Then heavy footsteps moving away from my tent, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep a wink the rest of the night. I just lay there, knife in hand, straining to hear any sound of its return. The hours until dawn were the longest of my life. When the first light of morning finally came, I waited another hour before working up the courage to unzip my tent. I poked my head out and scanned the area. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance. My backpack was still hanging where I'd left it on a tree branch about 20 feet from my tent. The camp looked undisturbed. Then I stepped out and saw them. Footprints. Huge barefoot impressions in the soft dirt around my campsite. They circled my tent multiple times, exactly matching the path of the scraping sounds I'd heard. I put my boot next to one for comparison. The print was easily over 17 inches long and proportionally wide. The toes were clearly defined, 5 of them, splayed out like a human's, but massive. I followed the tracks with my eyes, and that's when I noticed the broken branches. About 8 feet up on a nearby tree, several thick branches had been snapped off. Not cut, not broken by wind or snow, snapped cleanly, as if something very strong had broken them off in passing. 8 feet high. Just think about that for a second. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I packed up camp. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the tree line. I left half my breakfast uneaten, stuffed everything into my backpack as quickly as possible, and started hiking back toward the trailhead. I wanted to be back at my truck before nightfall, even though it meant a grueling full-day hike out. About 2 miles from my campsite, I saw fresh tracks crossing the trail. The same huge footprints, this time in a muddy section of the path. They hadn't been there the day before, I'm certain of it. Whatever had visited me during the night was on the move, and it seemed to be heading in the same general direction I was. That's when I heard the knocking for the first time. It's hard to describe if you haven't heard it before, but it was like someone taking a baseball bat and hitting a hollow tree. Loud, sharp cracks that echoed through the forest. 2 knocks, then 3, coming from deep in the woods to my right. A few minutes later, I heard answering knocks from much further away, off to my left. I picked up my pace, moving as quickly as I could while still being careful. The last thing I needed was a twisted ankle out there. The knocking continued sporadically for the next hour or so, always off in the distance, but seeming to pace me as I hiked. About halfway back to the trailhead, I felt it, that unmistakable feeling of being watched. You know that sensation when the hair on the back of your neck stands up. It was that, but 100 times stronger. I stopped and listened. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Then I heard it. The snap of a twig behind me, maybe 50 yards back. I spun around, but saw nothing except trees and underbrush. I started walking again, faster now, and heard another snap, closer this time. Something was following me on the trail. I didn't run. I wanted to, but every instinct told me not to. Running triggers predatory instincts, and whatever was following me was already interested enough. Instead, I maintained a brisk walk, my hand on my knife handle, constantly looking back over my shoulder. For the next 3 miles, this continued. I would hear movement behind me, a twig snapping, brush rustling. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing visible. The thing was smart, staying just out of sight, using the trees for cover. Occasionally, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, but never a clear view. Then came the growl. I was about 2 miles from the trailhead when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl from a ridge above the trail. It wasn't a bear or a cougar. I've heard both, and this was different, deeper, more guttural, and somehow more intelligent sounding, if that makes any sense. It was a warning. The last mile to my truck was the most terrifying experience of my life. The sun was starting to set, and the forest was getting dark. The sounds of something pacing me continued, but now it seemed like there might be more than one. I heard movement both behind me and to my sides, as if I was being flanked. When I finally spotted my truck in the parking lot, I broke into a full sprint. I heard crashing in the underbrush behind me, like something large was moving quickly. I didn't look back. I just ran, fumbling for my keys as I approached the vehicle. I practically dove into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and locked it in one motion. As I sat there panting, hands shaking too badly to get the key in the ignition, I looked at the tree line where the trail emerged. For just a moment, and I swear this is true, I saw a large, dark figure standing just inside the tree line, partially hidden by a large pine. It was tall, much taller than a man, with broad shoulders and long arms. I couldn't make out any details in the fading light, just this massive silhouette watching me. Then it stepped back and was gone. I started my truck and drove out of there as fast as I safely could on those gravel roads. I didn't stop until I hit the highway, and even then, I kept checking my rearview mirror. That was 14 years ago, and I've never gone back to Tenaway Ridge. In fact, I don't hike alone anymore, period. I still go backpacking, but always with a group, always with people I trust, and always with more than just a knife for protection. I've thought about that night thousands of times since then. I've read about bears, cougars, known wildlife in the area. I've considered every rational explanation I can think of, but I know what I experienced wasn't an animal, at least not any kind of animal we officially acknowledge. And it definitely wasn't human either. I don't know what to call what I encountered that night. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever. The label doesn't really matter. What matters is that something intelligent and enormous was out there. Something that was curious enough to investigate me, but restrained enough to leave me unharmed. And that, in some ways, is the most unsettling part of all. Story 13. I've never been one for the supernatural. Ghost stories, alien abductions, cryptids, all that stuff was just entertainment to me. I'd listen to my wife's family share their true encounters during holiday gatherings, nodding politely while thinking they were just embellishing local folklore. They're all from southeastern Louisiana, and according to them, the whole region is crawling with unexplainable creatures. Their favorite stories always involved something they called the White One, supposedly some kind of Bigfoot or Sasquatch with light-colored hair that roamed the back roads between Calvert and Elbridge. I would smile, ask questions to be polite, but inside, I was chalking it up to overactive imaginations, moonshine, or some combination of both. That was before June of 2001. I've replayed that night in my head thousands of times over the years. It was only a few seconds of my life, but it completely changed how I view the world. I've never shared this outside my immediate family before now, but I need to get this off my chest. Maybe someone else has seen what I saw. My wife Elaine and I had been visiting her parents in Oakville for the weekend. Her mom wasn't doing well, early stages of dementia, and we'd driven down from Baton Rouge to help sort through some things and discuss care options. It had been a draining couple of days, emotionally and physically. We decided to head back home late Sunday night after things had calmed down, figuring we'd beat the morning traffic and have time to rest before work on Monday. We left around midnight. Elaine was exhausted and fell asleep almost immediately after we got in the car. I remember turning the radio down low. Some classic rock station was playing Fleetwood Mac, and settling in for the drive with a thermos of coffee. The plan was to take Route 14 through Calvert, then connect to the highway that would take us back to Baton Rouge. It was warm, even for June in Louisiana. I had the AC going but kept the windows cracked to stay alert. The night was clear, nearly full moon. One of those nights where the sky feels enormous and you can see every star. Hardly any other cars on the road. About 20 minutes into the drive, I was approaching Calvert. If you've never been through that part of Louisiana, it's mostly flat, open land, part of the Mississippi River Delta region. Not a whole lot of places for anything to hide. There are patches of trees here and there, but nothing like the dense forests you'd find further north. The road was straight, with drainage ditches on either side, then fields stretching out beyond them. I remember checking the dashboard clock. It was about 1 in the morning. I was still wide awake, thinking about work the next day, going over a mental checklist for the week ahead. Elaine was still asleep beside me, head against the passenger window. I was maybe 5 miles outside of Calvert when my headlights caught something moving at the edge of the road ahead. At first, I thought it was a deer. We get plenty of those darting across roads in Louisiana, and I automatically eased off the gas, preparing to brake if needed. But as I got closer, maybe 30 yards away, I realized whatever was moving at the roadside was way too big to be a deer. My first coherent thought was bear, though that made no sense. We don't have bears that size in that part of Louisiana, and even if we did, what I was seeing didn't move like a bear. It was tall, standing fully upright at the edge of the road. I slowed the car to maybe 35 miles per hour, my brain trying to process what I was looking at. The headlights illuminated it clearly now, a massive figure covered in what looked like white or light-colored hair. Not fur, exactly, more like long hair hanging from its body. It was standing on 2 legs at the left side of the road, perfectly still, as if it had just noticed my approaching car. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles going white. My mind was racing through possibilities. Someone in a costume, some kind of prank. But who would be out here at 1 a.m. in the middle of nowhere? Then it moved. I've never seen anything move that fast with that much power. 1 second it was standing still, and the next it was basically a blur tearing across the road. 3, maybe 4 massive strides, and it had crossed both lanes and disappeared into the field on the other side. It didn't hesitate or look back, just explosive movement from a standstill. As it crossed in front of me, I got a clearer view. This thing was huge, at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. The body was massive, with long arms that swung as it ran. The proportions were all wrong for a human. The shoulders too broad, the arms too long, the legs bent oddly, not quite like a person's would. And that pale hair covering its entire body caught the moonlight as it moved. I hit the brakes harder than I meant to, causing the car to lurch. Elaine stirred but didn't wake up. I sat there for a moment, my hands shaking, staring at the spot where the creature had disappeared. There was nothing there now. No movement, no sound, nothing to indicate what had just crossed my path. I remember feeling cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. My mouth had gone completely dry. I fumbled for my coffee thermos, spilling some on my jeans as I tried to take a drink with trembling hands. Should I wake Elaine? Should I turn around, drive faster? I sat there for maybe 30 seconds, engine idling, trying to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. Part of me wanted to get out and look for tracks or evidence, but a stronger part knew that was a terrible idea. Whatever that thing was, it was still out there, and it moved a hell of a lot faster than I could. I put the car back in drive and continued on, a bit faster than before. I kept scanning the fields on either side of the road, half expecting to see it running alongside us or waiting to cross again. But there was nothing. As the initial shock wore off, I started trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was just a very tall person in some kind of costume or ghillie suit. But who would be out here? And why would they be crossing a deserted road at 1 in the morning? The way it moved didn't seem human either. Too fast, too powerful. And the height. I'm 6 foot myself, and this thing towered over what I'd estimate a tall human to be. Could it have been some kind of animal I just wasn't familiar with? But what animal stands upright at that height, has that body structure, and is covered in pale hair? The more I thought about it, the more my mind kept circling back to all those stories Elaine's family had told around the dinner table. The white one, they claimed, roamed these exact roads. The creature they insisted was some kind of Sasquatch or Bigfoot, the same stories I'd silently laughed off for years. I drove the rest of the way to Calvert in a daze, constantly checking my mirrors and scanning the roadside. When we reached town, I pulled into a gas station even though we had plenty of fuel. I just needed to stop somewhere with lights and other people. There was only one attendant inside, half asleep behind the counter. I bought a bottle of water and some gum I didn't need, just to have a normal human interaction. I debated whether to mention what I'd seen to the clerk, but what would I say? Hey, I just saw Bigfoot cross Route 14. He'd think I was drunk or crazy, so I paid for my items, used the bathroom, and went back to the car. Elaine was awake by then, asking why we'd stopped. I made up something about needing caffeine and offered to let her drive the rest of the way, but she was still too tired and declined. As we got back on the road, I almost told her what happened, but something held me back. She'd believe me. She knew I wasn't the type to make up stories. But then I'd have to admit that all those family tales I'd dismissed might actually be true. I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. The rest of the drive home was uneventful but tense. Every shadow along the roadside made me flinch. I kept the car at exactly the speed limit, not wanting to be pulled over, but also not wanting to linger on those roads any longer than necessary. When we got home around 3 in the morning, I was exhausted, but knew I wouldn't sleep. While Elaine went straight to bed, I sat in our living room with all the lights on, searching online for any reports of unusual creature sightings in southeastern Louisiana. There were plenty, as it turned out, many describing exactly what I'd seen. A tall, light-colored, hair-covered bipedal creature moving with incredible speed. I found reports dating back decades, concentrated especially around the areas between Calvert and Elbridge, exactly where Elaine's family had always claimed sightings happened. Some witnesses described the same blur-like movement I'd seen, that explosion of speed that didn't seem possible for something so large. I finally told Elaine what I'd seen a few days later. She wasn't surprised, just nodded and said, "Now you know why Grandpa Joe never drives that road after dark." She'd grown up with these stories and had always accepted them as fact. To her, my sighting was just confirmation of something she already believed. I went back to that stretch of Route 14 the following weekend, in daylight this time. I'm not sure what I expected to find. Footprints, hair, some kind of evidence, but there was nothing unusual. Just the same flat fields, drainage ditches and scattered trees. Whatever crossed my path that night had left no trace. In the months and years since, I've spoken with a few of Elaine's relatives about what I saw. They were almost frustratingly casual about it, as if I was telling them I'd seen a particularly large raccoon. "Oh yeah, that's the white one," her uncle said. "Been seeing it out that way since I was a kid. It doesn't bother nobody if you don't bother it." I've become a reluctant believer, not just in the possibility of undiscovered creatures, but in the idea that there are things in this world that defy easy explanation. I used to pride myself on being rational, on finding logical explanations for everything. Now, I'm not so sure. I've driven that stretch of Route 14 maybe a dozen times since that night, always in daylight, always scanning the fields and tree lines. I've never seen it again. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if fatigue and the power of suggestion after years of hearing those stories combined to create a vivid hallucination. But then I remember the clarity of that moment, the way the light hit its pale hair, the impossible speed of its movement, the way my entire body responded with instinctual fear. Whatever crossed my path that night was real. I can't explain what it was, but I know what I saw. And I no longer smile politely when people share their own strange encounters, because now I have one of my own, and 22 years later, I still can't make sense of it. So that's my story. I've never written it down before, never shared it outside family, but it happened, just as I've described it. That night on Route 14, just outside of Calvert, Louisiana, in June of 2001, I saw something that shouldn't exist, and it changed everything I thought I knew about the world. Story 14. I've been hesitant to share this experience online, but after reading similar accounts from others, I figured it might help me process what happened. This took place in October of 2015, and I still get goosebumps thinking about it. My girlfriend Jenna and I had been planning this hiking trip for months. We're both experienced hikers and campers. I've been doing wilderness trips since I was a kid, and Jenna had gotten into it when we started dating 3 years earlier. We decided to do a weekend trip to Dany Creek in the high forest area near Snoqualmie Pass. It's a beautiful spot, especially in fall with all the colors changing. The weather forecast looked perfect, cool but not freezing, with clear skies. We arrived Friday afternoon and hiked about 4 miles in to set up our campsite along a ridge that overlooked a small valley. The spot was perfect, flat ground for the tent, a natural rock formation that blocked wind from the north, and enough clearing to have a decent fire pit. We set up our 2-person tent, gathered firewood, and made dinner as the sun was setting. That first night was peaceful, just the sounds of the forest, some distant owls, and the crackling of our campfire. We turned in around 10, planning to do a day hike further into the forest the next morning. Saturday went exactly as planned. We hiked about 6 miles on a loop trail, had lunch by a small waterfall, and made it back to camp, with plenty of daylight to spare. We cooked a freeze-dried meal, played some cards, and enjoyed another campfire before getting into our sleeping bags around 11. I remember joking with Jenna about how perfect the trip had been. No rain, no forgotten supplies, no blisters. We should have known better than to tempt fate like that. I'd been asleep for maybe an hour when the first sound jarred me awake. At first, I thought it was just a branch falling. The forest makes all kinds of noises at night, and I'm usually pretty good at sleeping through them. But then I heard it again, a sharp snap, like someone stepping on a thick branch. Then another. These weren't random forest sounds. They were footsteps, heavy footsteps. I nudged Jenna. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. She was already awake, eyes wide in the darkness. "Yeah," she whispered back. "Is it a bear?" That was my first thought too. We were in black bear country, and while they usually avoid humans, sometimes they'll investigate campsites looking for food. We'd properly stored our food in a bear canister about 100 feet from our tent, so I wasn't too worried. But as the footsteps continued, something felt off. They were too deliberate, too measured, like something was pacing. Around and around our fire circle it went, breathing heavily. And I mean heavily. I could hear each breath, slow, deep inhales and exhales that didn't sound like any bear I'd ever encountered. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Jenna gripped my arm, her fingernails digging into my skin. "What should we do?" she whispered. I reached for my flashlight with my free hand. "I'm going to look," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in a silvery glow. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, near a large pine tree about 20 yards from our tent, I saw it. I can't adequately describe the shock of seeing something you've only heard about in campfire stories standing right in front of you. This creature was massive. Not just tall, though it had to be at least 7 or 8 feet, but built like a linebacker on steroids. It had a barrel chest that tapered down to a narrower waist, with arms that hung unnaturally long, almost to its knees. Its legs were thick and powerful looking, planted firmly on the ground. But what struck me most was its posture. It was just standing there, perfectly still, watching our tent. The hair covering its body was dark and shaggy, matted in places. Its head sat low between its shoulders, almost like it didn't have much of a neck at all. In the moonlight, I couldn't make out facial features clearly, which I'm now grateful for. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute. It didn't move, it just watched. I slowly zipped the tent back up, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the zipper. "What is it?" Jenna asked, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," I lied. I knew exactly what it looked like, but my brain wasn't ready to accept it. "Something big. Let's just stay quiet." No sooner had I said this than we heard a deep grunt, followed by a loud crack. Something heavy landed just outside our tent. I nearly jumped out of my skin. "It threw something at us," Jenna whispered, tears in her voice. We sat frozen, listening as the footsteps resumed. It was circling our tent now, closer than before. The breathing was louder, interspersed with occasional snorts and low, rumbling sounds that I can only describe as guttural. Not quite growls, but vibrating vocalizations that made the hair on my arms stand up. Then the footsteps stopped. For a few seconds, there was complete silence. I remember thinking maybe it had left, but deep down I knew better. The silence was almost worse than the footsteps. And then, a pressure against the side of the tent. Not a poke or a jab, but the slow, deliberate press of what felt like a hand. A massive hand. The nylon material of the tent dimpled inward, creating a clear outline of 5 fingers. 5 very large fingers spread wide. The hand stayed there for maybe 3 seconds before withdrawing. Jenna had both hands clamped over her mouth to keep from screaming. I was paralyzed, my mind racing with possible options, but my body refusing to move. Should we make noise to scare it off? Stay silent and hope it loses interest? Run for the car that was 4 miles away in pitch darkness? None seemed like good choices. The circling continued. Sometimes it would move away, and the footsteps would grow fainter, giving us a moment of relief. Then they'd return, closer than ever. This went on for what must have been hours, though it felt like an eternity. At some point, Jenna curled up against me, her entire body trembling. I held her, listening to every sound outside, trying to track where the creature was. Around what I guess was 4 in the morning, the forest began to lighten ever so slightly with pre-dawn. The footsteps seemed to grow more distant, and eventually we couldn't hear them at all. Even so, we didn't dare leave the tent until full daylight broke through the trees. When we finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent, the forest looked deceptively normal. Birds were chirping, the morning mist was rising from the valley below. It could have been any beautiful morning in the woods, except for what we found around our campsite. Footprints, massive footprints deeply embedded in the soft ground. I put my boot next to one for comparison. My size 11 hiking boot looked like a child's footprint next to it. These prints had to be at least 19 inches long, with 5 clearly defined toes. The stride between prints was enormous, easily 6 to 7 feet apart. No human could make strides that large. Near our tent was a branch, not a small twig, but a substantial limb that had been snapped clean off a nearby tree. This was what had landed outside our tent during the night. It would have taken considerable strength to break it off. Strangely, nothing in our camp had been disturbed. Our food canister was untouched. Our backpacks, which we'd left leaning against a log, were exactly as we'd left them. Whatever had visited us wasn't interested in our supplies. It was interested in us. We packed up in record time, barely speaking except to coordinate what needed to be done. Both of us kept scanning the tree line, expecting to see something watching us. The feeling of being observed was overwhelming, even though I couldn't see anything. The hike out was the most nerve-wracking 4 miles I've ever walked. We kept hearing sounds, branches breaking, rustling in the underbrush, but always just ahead of us or behind us, never where we could see. It felt like we were being herded off the mountain, like something was making sure we left. At one point, about halfway back to the trailhead, we heard a series of wood knocks. 3 distinct strikes, like someone hitting a tree with a stick. Then, from much further away, came an answering series of knocks. Jenna grabbed my arm so hard, I had bruises later. "There's more than one," she whispered. I couldn't deny it any longer. "I think we ran into a Sasquatch last night," I said, finally voicing what we'd both been thinking. She just nodded, her face pale. When we finally reached our car, the relief was indescribable. We threw our gear in the back and got out of there as fast as possible. We barely talked on the drive home, both lost in our own thoughts. It's been 7 years, and I still think about that night regularly. Neither of us has gone back to that area of the forest. I've done a lot of research since then, reading accounts from others who've had similar experiences. The behavior we witnessed, the investigation of our camp, the wood knocking, the way it seemed to escort us out, matches patterns that others have reported. What stays with me most is the intelligence behind the encounter. This wasn't just an animal reacting on instinct. The creature was curious about us, but it didn't seem aggressive, just territorial. It could have easily torn through our tent if it wanted to harm us. Instead, it examined us, intimidated us a bit, and then made sure we left its territory. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I know how it sounds. Before this happened, I probably would have been skeptical too. But I know what I saw, what I heard, and what I felt. There's something out there in those woods that's more aware, more intelligent than most people are willing to acknowledge. Something that watches and understands more than we realize. I still hike and camp, but never alone anymore, and never in that region. Sometimes when I'm in the woods, I get that feeling again. The sensation of being watched. When that happens, I head back to civilization pretty quickly. Some mysteries in nature are better left unexplored. I don't know if anyone else here has experienced anything similar, but it helps just to get this off my chest. For those who think Sasquatch is just a myth or a misidentified bear, I hope you never have the experience that proves you wrong. Story 15. I still get chills when I think about what happened that night in early 1988. I was 23 then, and Sarah was 21. We'd been dating for about 2 years, and like most young couples without much money or privacy, we'd find places to park and just be together. Behind the Carbondale High School Gymnasium became our spot. Quiet, dark, and usually deserted after hours. It was a Friday night in February, unusually warm for that time of year. I remember because Sarah had worn just a light jacket, and I'd teased her about it earlier when we met up. We'd been to a movie at the small theater downtown. Can't even remember what we saw now. Isn't that strange? Some details fade while others burn themselves into your memory forever. We drove my old blue Chevy Nova to our usual spot around 10:30. The school was dark, except for a couple security lights that cast long shadows across the parking lot. The gym was this brick building with a flat roof, and behind it were the tennis courts and then a line of trees that separated the school property from some farmland. We'd been there dozens of times before, without anything unusual happening. I parked in our usual spot, where we could see if anyone was coming, but were mostly hidden from the main road. We had the radio on low. I think it was playing Journey or maybe REO Speedwagon, and we were just talking and kissing. Nothing crazy. There were these tall lights around the tennis courts, but they were off, of course. The only illumination came from those yellow security lights mounted on the gym wall and the moonlight. I don't know exactly when I started feeling weird. It might have been around 11. At first, it was just this vague uneasiness, like when you think you've forgotten something important but can't figure out what. I wasn't really focusing on it, but I kept glancing at my rearview mirror for some reason. Sarah must have been feeling it too, because she stopped mid-sentence during our conversation and looked out her window. "You okay?" I asked her. "Yeah, I don't know. Do you feel like someone's watching us?" That's when I realized that's exactly what I was feeling. That prickly sensation on the back of your neck when you're being observed. I sat up straighter and scanned the area, but didn't see anything right away. "Probably just a security guard making rounds," I said. But I didn't believe it. The school hardly ever had security patrol the grounds at night, especially not that late. The feeling got stronger, though. It wasn't like normal paranoia when you're somewhere you're not supposed to be. This was deeper, more primal. Sarah kept looking out her window toward the tennis courts, and I could tell she was getting genuinely scared because she grabbed my arm. "Dan, I think we should go," she whispered, and her voice had that tight quality people get when they're trying not to sound scared. I was about to start the car when I saw it. Near the far end of the tennis court, where the fence was highest, probably 12 feet tall to keep balls from flying out, there was this figure. At first, my brain tried to make it into something normal. A shadow from a tree, maybe a piece of equipment left out. But then I realized it was moving. Not much, just this gentle, swaying motion from side to side, almost like it was shifting its weight from one foot to another. "Do you see that?" I whispered, nodding toward the fence. Sarah followed my gaze, and I felt her hand tighten on my arm. "What is that?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Is that a person?" But we both knew it wasn't a person, at least not a normal one. This thing was massive. The tennis court fence was about 12 feet high at its tallest point, and this figure's head was right up near the top. I'm not great with spatial judgment, especially in the dark, but this thing had to be at least 8 or 9 feet tall, maybe even taller. What made it worse was how still it was. Besides that slight swaying, it just stood there, and I absolutely knew, it was looking at us. I couldn't make out any features. It was just this black silhouette against the slightly less black background of the trees beyond. But it had this presence that was unmistakable. I fumbled for my keys, thinking we needed to get out of there, but Sarah grabbed my wrist. "Wait," she whispered. "Don't make any sudden movements." It was solid advice. Whatever this thing was, I didn't want to provoke it. So we sat there, frozen, watching it and it watching us. The radio was still playing softly, some slow song now, creating this surreal soundtrack to the most terrifying moment of my life. For what felt like forever, but was probably 3 or 4 minutes, nothing happened. The figure just stood there, swaying almost imperceptibly, and we sat paralyzed in the car. Then, without any hurry, it turned. The movement was so deliberate, so controlled. It wasn't startled or running away. It just decided to leave. The thing turned and began walking toward the tree line beyond the tennis court. Its gait was smooth and measured, taking these long strides that covered ground quickly, despite not seeming rushed, and it was completely silent. Even with the car windows up and the radio on, we should have heard something. Branches breaking, leaves crunching, but there was nothing. When it was about halfway to the trees, It did something that still haunts my dreams. It turned its head, just its head, back toward us. I couldn't see eyes or a face, just this massive silhouette with its head rotated unnaturally far to look back at us. Then it continued walking until it disappeared into the darkness of the tree line. The moment it was gone, Sarah burst into tears. The tension that had been building just broke her. I wasn't doing much better. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I started the car and backed out of there as fast as I could, tires squealing on the asphalt. We didn't talk much on the drive back to Sarah's place. What was there to say? We'd both seen it. We both knew it wasn't a person in a costume or some weird shadow play. It was too big, too fluid in its movements, too aware. When I pulled up to her house, Sarah finally spoke. "What was that, Dan?" I shook my head. "I don't know. I really don't." "We can't tell anyone," she said. "They'll think we're crazy or that we were drunk or high." She was right, of course. Who would believe us? I walked her to her door and we hugged for a long time. Neither of us wanted to be alone with our thoughts. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that silhouette turning its head to look at us. By morning, I'd convinced myself I needed to go back and check the area in daylight. Part of me hoped I'd find evidence, footprints, broken branches, anything to prove that what we'd seen was real. Another part hoped I'd discover some rational explanation that would let me sleep at night again. I drove back to the school around noon. It looked so different in the daylight. Just a normal high school with a gym and tennis courts and a line of trees beyond. I parked in the same spot and walked to the tennis courts, trying to appear casual in case anyone was around. The fence was as tall as I remembered, especially at the far end where maintenance equipment was stored. I walked to where I thought the figure had been standing, looking for anything unusual. The ground was hard-packed dirt there, so there were no visible footprints. I checked the fence for fur or cloth that might have been snagged, but found nothing. I followed the path it had taken toward the tree line. The trees were mostly oak and maple, bare in February, with some pines mixed in. Once I reached the edge of the woods, I hesitated. Did I really want to go in there? What if that thing was still around? It was broad daylight, I reminded myself, and I needed to know. I spent about an hour searching those woods, looking for signs of something large passing through, but found nothing conclusive. There were some broken branches high up, but that could have been from winds or ice. No footprints in the winter-hardened ground, no tufts of hair, nothing. When I got back to my car, I sat there for a while, staring at the spot where we'd seen it. Was it possible we'd both hallucinated? Had we worked ourselves into a state of paranoia and seen something that wasn't there? But why would we have the exact same hallucination? I didn't tell anyone else about what happened. Sarah and I talked about it sometimes, trying to make sense of it. We considered all the possibilities. A really tall person playing a prank, a bear standing on its hind legs, though there hadn't been bears in that part of Missouri for decades, some kind of mass hysteria between the two of us. But deep down, we both knew what we'd seen, the height, the deliberate movements, the way it turned its head to look back at us, the complete silence of its departure. It wasn't human. It took months before we could go parking anywhere secluded again. We never went back to that spot behind the gymnasium. Sarah would sometimes wake up from nightmares about it, and I'd find myself scanning the tree lines whenever we drove past wooded areas. About 6 months later, we were at her cousin's barbecue when one of the older guests, after a few beers, started telling stories about strange sightings in the woods around Carbondale back in the 60s. He talked about hunters finding unusual tracks and people hearing weird vocalizations at night. He never used the word Bigfoot or Sasquatch, just called them the woods people. Sarah and I looked at each other across the picnic table, but said nothing. I've spent 35 years trying to make sense of what we saw that night. I've read books on cryptozoology, joined online forums where people share similar experiences, even gone on a couple of organized searches in other states. I've never seen anything like it again, but I've heard enough similar accounts to know we weren't alone in our experience. Sarah and I broke up a year after the incident for reasons unrelated to what we saw. We've stayed in touch over the years, though. Sometimes when we talk on the phone, there's a pause in the conversation, and I know we're both thinking about it. That silhouette against the night sky, that deliberate turn of the head, that silent retreat into the darkness. I don't know what we saw behind Carbondale High that night in 1988, but I know it saw us. And sometimes, when I'm driving past wooded areas at night, I can't help but scan the tree line, wondering if it's still out there, watching and waiting. To this day, I can't explain what we encountered. I've tried to rationalize it countless times, but nothing fits. It was too tall to be human, too deliberate in its movements to be an animal, too aware of us to be anything natural. And that's what haunts me the most. Not just what I saw, but what it might mean about what else is out there, just beyond the reach of our understanding, watching us from the shadows.